Chapter 1276, Dance of Monsters. Sunny was ready for battle. Now, he wasn't Sunny anymore. He was a mighty serpent, clad in an armor of onyx scales, with fangs as sharp as diamonds and enough fury to incinerate the world. But that was not enough. Following his wrathful roar, the shell hiding below his scales turned into the adamantine mantle. A fearsome obsidian armor encased his flexible body, light as a feather and crafted so intricately as not to restrict his movement in any way. The water exploded into the air when he dove into the depths that belonged to him and him alone. "Old snake!" The call escaped his monstrous maw, turned into a senseless roar. What he had done was simple, but also indescribably hard. He had dove deeper into shadow dance than ever before, mirroring both the mind and the physique of a nightmare creature. He had not been sure that it would be possible until the last moment, but his meticulous preparation paid off. It was do or die, nothing less. He had spent countless hours observing the azure serpent and learning everything there was to learn about it. Then, he dissolved into the shadows and manifested himself back into a tangible form. Finally, he summoned the dead shadow of the black turtle, which he had lured into the lantern to form a mighty shell around his fragile incarnation. But, for the first time, the shape of his shell was not that of the shadow fiend. Instead, it was the shape of a monstrous river serpent, the shape of the mad beast whom he feared, admired, and wanted to kill. Of course, this shadow shell could not compare to the real thing. He was only an ascended, after all, while the azure serpent was a great beast. It was weaker, less resilient and smaller, maybe a quarter of the size of the actual abomination. However, it was suffused with the power of both shadows and soul flame, granting it power well beyond the limits of what an ascended could possess. It was also protected by the mantle, and made to reign the depths. Only, there was another challenging his reign. A maddening fury consumed his mind, and he shot forward through the water like a black spear. He could feel it, the scent of blood spilling from the mangled body of the older, stronger beast. So what if it was older? So what if it was stronger? It would be torn apart by his fangs anyway. The azure serpent had felt him too. He sensed a vast shadow rising from below to meet him. It was brimming with harrowing power and terrifying madness, but he was not afraid. He didn't know how to be afraid. All he knew was wrath and bloodlust, the two of them. A colossal serpent covered in beautiful azure scales and a smaller serpent encased in obsidian armor, wreathed in shadows and blinding white radiance, collided in the water, causing gargantuan waves to rise on the surface of the great river. Their first collision would have been his last if he had not twisted his body at the last moment, evading the azure serpent's deadly maw and diving under its belly. He had to remind himself that he was lost from light. He was not a mindless nightmare creature. He was not a beast. He was cunning, resourceful, and skilled. He possessed the honed battle sense of a masterful warrior and the powerful soul of a tyrant. It was a strange thing to both believe that he was a serpent with all his heart and know that he was something else. Losing himself in the dance was just too easy, but his true name was like a beacon that guided him home. Sunny, understood that he had to remember himself if he wanted to survive. His current form was immensely powerful, no less powerful than a saint's transcendent form would have been, perhaps. He could feel the barriers that had been preventing him from mastering the fourth step of shadow dance breaking. He could feel his boundless bestial strength, but, in front of the azure serpent, that strength was almost laughable. Despite the terrible wounds covering the body of the great beast, it was still infinitely more powerful than his, which was why he had to be devious, cunning, and sober if he wanted to kill his enemy. He had to be deranged and overcome by fury, too. He had to guide his mad fury and sharpen it into a cold and merciless blade. Sunny twisted his serpentine body, dodging the maw of the ancient abomination, and sunk his fangs into an open wound on the azure serpent's neck. It was only for a moment, though. Giving up on tearing out a chunk of flesh, he let go and darted upward a split second later. It was just in time, because the Leviathan's jaws snapped closed just a meter behind him in the next moment. The two of them clashed furiously as they ascended from the depths. The azure serpent was much larger, more powerful, and terrifyingly domineering. The black serpent was smaller and more nimble, circling around the dreadful beast and delivering vicious bites one after another. However, even without being caught in the Leviathan's jaws, Sunny was suffering tremendous harm. As their bodies brushed against each other, a vast stretch of the mantle cracked and shattered. The shadows below rippled, the internal structure of the shell twisting and breaking apart. The violent currents created by the passing of the azure serpent's body were slowing him down, and his dark flesh was sliced open by the creature's dorsal fin. His shell was bleeding shadows. His essence was being burned. His mind was drowning in pain and derangement. More, more, more. Despite knowing that it would cost him his life, Sonny felt compelled to bite into the enemy's flesh and never let go, to hurt the foe as much as he could, even if it meant death, to rip apart, to devour, to destroy. Instead, he continued to dodge the attacks of the azure serpent with clarity and skill, all the while attacking with hatred and fury when he could. And, all along, he was leading the great beast upward. Finally, they broke the surface and clashed again above the water. The suns were gone, and the river had not started glowing yet. The shaking world was dark. With a stifled roar, Sonny dodged the fangs of the azure serpent and tried to bite into an open wound on its mangled body, where white bone could be seen. However, before he could, the mad beast's tail crashed into him like an obliterating ram, sending fragments of the mantle flying through the air and a blinding flash of pain piercing in his soul. Sonny fell heavily into the water, and a tall fountain of white foam rose into the sky. The azure serpent let out a demented growl and lunged at him, aiming to bite the hateful worm in half. Before he could, however, 2 arrows, one black, one white, fell from the darkness and pierced its flesh. Saint and Nephis had joined the battle. Chapter 1277, Fourth Step. Sonny had suffered to lure the azure serpent to the surface, but there was a good reason to guide the mad beast there. 2 reasons even. Saint and Nephis. Although neither of them were as capable of fighting the abomination in the water as Sonny was, they could still play an important role in the battle. It was just that he had to create an opportunity for them to do so, and he had. As Sonny was convulsing from pain, 2 arrows struck the raging Leviathan. One was entirely black, as if forged out of pure darkness, which it was, augmented both by her and abilities, as well as the enhancement of the stifled scream. Saint's arrow pierced the azure serpent's one remaining eye. It was the darkest hour of the night, and so her strength was at its peak. More than that, this first shot she sent was empowered by the dreadful destructiveness of the enchantment, and so it delivered the most damage. And yet, the giant eye of the ancient Leviathan still wasn't destroyed. It was only damaged, becoming painted red, which made the mad beast look even more menacing. Sonny had put a lot of hope into this first salvo, but he was left disappointed. It didn't matter though. During their violent ascent, he had been strategically trying to place himself on the side of the azure serpent where it was blind. However, there was no advantage to be gained there. Whatever senses the enemy was using to perceive his movements were perfect and precise, even without vision. His plan to blind the mad beast had been meaningless from the start. The second arrow was white. Its impact was not nearly as forceful as that of the first arrow, but it was still quite ferocious. Nephis had always used a sword, but it was simply a preference. As a legacy, she had been trained in the use of all kinds of weapons, and that certainly included bows. There was a powerful memory longbow in her sole arsenal, crafted by the Forge Masters of Valor, and several enchanted arrows as well. But even then, the white arrow barely managed to pierce the flesh of the azure serpent, despite sliding faithfully into an already existing wound, where the azure scales and the tough skin of the Leviathan had already been torn open by the dark butterfly. The damage was negligible. That was just as expected, too. Neph's goal was not to wound the great beast with her arrows. Instead, it was to deliver the black venom from the overflowing bitter cusp into its flesh. She coated the arrowheads with the toxin before each shot. 1 dose of the black venom was not going to affect the azure serpent much, but 10, 20, or 30 could weaken it, perhaps. Sonny did not expect Saint and Nephis to bring the mad beast down. After all 5 shadows and all the soul flame were augmenting him, and him alone. He was the only one with the ability to truly damage the abomination. But they had to harass and weaken it so that he could deliver a fatal strike. It seemed to be working. The 2 arrows had not seriously wounded the azure serpent, but they had distracted it for a second. That second was enough for Sonny to shake off the terrible pain of having his soul damaged and slightly repair his shell. Letting out a wrathful hiss, he shot forward and bit into the side of the Leviathan. Even though the shadow shell had no taste buds, he could swear that he sensed the salty taste of blood on his tongue. That taste drove him into a frenzy. Devour. I am going to devour you. I am going to rip you apart. Forgetting the pain, forgetting the suffering, Sonny pressed his mighty jaws together in an attempt to savage and mutilate his enemy. It was only through an incredible effort that he forced himself to maintain control and let go, dashing aside just in time to avoid being trapped and crushed in the coils of the azure serpent's colossal body. A drop of cold fear fell into the incinerating inferno of his fury. This is dangerous. Battling a great beast was already perilous enough, but the act of assuming the shape and form of a nightmare creature, of diving into its mind and heart so deeply, was in and of itself a great danger. Sunny had used shadow dance to read abominations before, but he had never tried to manifest himself into one of them. It was too easy to get lost in that state, maybe forever. Even the true name was not a panacea. He also had to maintain his sense of self, while simultaneously denying it. Maybe this was the fourth step of shadow dance, the ability to preserve his identity while becoming truly formless in mind, body, and soul, and thus infinitely malleable, like all shadows were. As Sunny nimbly dodged the attacks of the azure serpent and lashed out with his sharp fangs and crushing tail, more arrows fell from the darkness. Saint was not using any more, instead trying to weigh the Leviathan down with the help of Kud. Nephis was continuing to poison the great beast with the toxin of the bitter cusp. However, the abomination had quickly grown impatient with their harassment. Its movements changed slightly, and the next time the two shot their bows, a tall wave suddenly rose, washing the arrows away. That gave Sunny an opportunity to deliver a vicious blow, however. Coiling himself around a mangled span of the azure serpent's body, he slithered forward. His sharp dorsal fin bit into the mad beast's flesh, shredding it like a saw. The soft glow of the brightening water was suddenly painted in a crimson hue. Die, 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 I am going to kill you. The azure serpent growled and lunged at him, madness burning in its bleeding eye. It was probably thinking the same. Chapter 1278, Mutual Destruction. The great river was foaming and seething, gargantuan waves rising from its softly glowing expanse to crash into the weathered slopes of the crumbling island. Two dark silhouettes, one colossal, the other merely giant, were moving through the raging water, intertwined in a murderous battle. Sunny had been driven mad by pain and bloodlust. He lost count of the number of blows his obsidian, serpentine body had endured. He also did not know how many times he retaliated, biting the flesh and breaking the scales of the azure serpent. His mantle was in shambles, the failing miserably to keep up with the barrage of devastating attacks he had to endure. The fearsome onyx armor was cracked and shattered, revealing the glossy black scales beneath. Many of its segments were entirely destroyed. The shadow shell that it was encasing had been shredded and ravaged as well. Giant wounds were gaping on it, bleeding shadows. He had been able to repair some of the damage at first, but having the means to do something like that, it seemed so distant now. There was one thing that filled Sunny with dark glee, though. It was that the azure serpent looked no better than him. The body of the great beast had already been grotesquely mangled before their battle, and now it was in an even worse state. The wounds that had closed were reopened. The wounds that had been opened were now wider and more harrowing, with crimson blood flowing out of them into the radiant water. Dozens of arrows were sticking out of the abomination's scarlet flesh. Some of them weighed it down, some sent a deadly toxin circulating through its bloodstream. But the azure serpent's eyes still burned with the same madness. Good, don't you give up on me, old snake. Sunny wanted to kill the hateful beast, but he didn't want that death to be swift. No, he wanted his enemy's agony to last forever. He wanted to tear its flesh with his fangs forever, feel the shudders of pain pulsing through its body forever, hear its pained cries forever. Control yourself. Snapping out of the consuming madness, he reminded himself of his goal. He needed to kill the azure serpent as fast as possible, not only because his essence was not limitless, but also because the chances of him being killed by the great beast were much higher than the other way around. If there was the smallest chance, he had to take it. It was just that there were no chances. Still, there were none. The mad beast was still in full control of both itself and the battlefield. The water flowed and twisted to aid it and constrain Sunny, as if obediently following the ancient serpent's commands. Even with its body looking like that of a battered corpse and its mind flooded with pain, the azure serpent remained fixated on the solitary goal of destroying its opponent with a truly insane level of focus. But Sunny could feel his mind growing muddled and his reason wavering. Oh, I can't go on much longer. For the first time since he had assumed the shape of the onyx serpent, the cold realization that defeat was possible entered his consciousness. The thought was so incongruous with the essence of his monstrous form that the shadow shell almost came undone. He held on to his maddening fury and pushed the thoughts of defeat away. Defeat was not possible. Such a thing did not exist. He would never lose. He would not lose again. That last thought was slightly strange, as if it was not his own. Grinding his fangs, Sunny pushed his enormous body through the hostile water, aiming to ram the side of the twisting leviathan. He knew that the battle had already turned in his enemy's favor, so he needed to do something to balance the scales. But what? The onyx serpent raged as it burned with the mad desire to destroy his enemy. However, Sunny was also calm and cool-headed. What advantages did he have that the great beast did not possess? Both of them were already half dead. He had to kill the enemy, but being killed by the enemy seemed inevitable instead. So, then, the two outcomes were not necessarily mutually exclusive. Being killed did not directly stand in the way of achieving his goal. It was only the timing of his death that was the issue. Sunny was filled with an indescribable, furious determination to slay the azure serpent. Nothing mattered in front of this hatred and this consuming need, least of all death. It would be all worth it if he could just feel the life leaving his enemy's bleeding body. Mutual destruction. Yes, he liked it. He liked it a lot. This was the advantage he so desperately needed. Dangerous flames ignited in Sunny's onyx eyes as he twisted his long neck and glared at the reeling serpent. The great beast must have been growing weaker as well. His attacks and the arrows of his companions were slowly grinding down its boundless endurance. The abomination had been a split second too late and failed to evade being rammed by Sunny's serpentine head, which finally gave him the chance. First, the water. The water had been constraining Sunny, and so he had to wrestle the control of it from the azure serpent first. With his understanding of the great beast and the experience of watching Knave and Bloodwave fight, he could achieve dominance for a few moments at least. Coiling his mighty body like a spring, Sunny shot forward with incredible speed. He moved it in a specific way, forcing a powerful current to rush outward and collide with the opposing one, which had been created by the ancient Leviathan. A great whirlpool appeared where the two currents collided, and he tore through it unopposed. Second, the target. The target was the azure serpent's titanic spine. Sunny had to sever it no matter what. Usually the spine would have been protected by layers of impenetrable muscle, a layer of impervious skin, and a dreadful armor of indestructible scales. But the mad beast had been mangled and mutilated by the long weeks of warding off marauding abominations and the eerily monstrous butterfly. Large chunks of its flesh were missing, revealing bone. At a particular spot just below its head, a long span of the spine was revealed too. That was a good target to choose, especially because the abomination would not be able to use its jaws to defend it. And, lastly, the advantage. Sunny did indeed possess an advantage in the battle of mutual destruction. It was because the azure serpent was made of flesh while he was made of shadows. If he sustained too much damage, the shadow shell was going to fall apart. But his incarnation, which was small and hidden in its depths, could survive. It was just a matter of luck. Either he would be destroyed along with the shell, or get lucky and remain alive. But regardless of the outcome, the hateful Leviathan would die. I am fine with that. Growling viciously, the black serpent shot through the shining waters of the great river, and, discarding all pretenses of defense, closed his jaws on the great beast's spine. Chapter 1279 Raging Waves. Sunny bit into the spine of the azure serpent, igniting what little strength he had left into a violent and furious blaze. Billowing shadows and flame rose from his onyx scales and wreathed him like a burial shroud. His eyes shone with mad, morbid, murderous malice and chillingly cold killing intent. His jaw pressed down with enough force to shatter mountains. But the spine of a great beast was much stronger than a mountain chain. It resisted his obsidian fangs, refusing to be broken, cracked, or even scratched. Die, die, drowning in fury. Sunny put all of his resolve, all of his hatred, and all of his desire into crushing the indestructible bone. He violently jerked his head left and right, gnawing on the spine like a rabid dog. If he could not bite through it, he would saw through it. If he could not saw through it, he would grind it down. The azure serpent was going to die, no matter what. It was already half dead, anyway. However, so was Sunny. He sensed the gargantuan body of the ancient Leviathan moving, and coldly refused to pay it any attention. It did not matter how the mad beast would try to destroy him, or if it would succeed. Sunny had already discarded his survival instinct. The mad beast could not reach him with its harrowing maw, which meant that it was not going to be able to kill him instantly. That was all he needed to know. As his fangs scraped against the spine of the azure serpent in a frenzy, the abomination's mangled body rose and ensnared Sunny like a crushing vice. Once he was caught in the coils, there would be no escape. He knew it, but he did not care. All he cared about was the feeling of a thin, shallow crack finally appearing under one of his fangs. The Leviathan's spine was giving. Die. As dark glee washed over his heart, the coils tensed, crushing his ravaged shell. The strength contained within them was unlike anything Sunny had experienced before. It was truly and utterly harrowing. Pressing down with harrowing strength, the azure serpent turned the marble carapace of the mantle into stone dust. The serpentine body beneath it was instantly broken, the onyx scales shattering, sharp edges of broken bones piercing the skin and protruding from the horrid wounds. There was blinding pain, but Sunny did not care. More cracks appeared on the abomination's spine now, spreading and merging with each other, and he could feel the giant body of his enemy twitching in pain. He could also feel fragments of bone sinking beneath his fangs. Instead of struggling to save himself, Sunny ferociously bit down on the damaged spine of the Leviathan and persisted in his frenzied attempts to break and mutilate it. Let's see which one of us dies first, old snake, as long as you die first. I don't mind dying second. The dorsal fin of the great beast effortlessly cut into his shell, slicing it open like a saw. Instead of blood, darkness flowed out of the vivisected serpent, only to dissolve and disappear in the soft radiance of the glowing water. Sunny pressed his jaws together in all-consuming fury, and finally felt the bone crumble beneath his bite. Will my incarnation be destroyed? Or won't it? Not that it mattered too much. Killing the enemy was the only thing that mattered. There was nothing else. A strange sound that was half a deranged roar and half a wail of agony escaped from his maw. His jaws started to slowly move toward each other. At the same time, the damage his body had received was nearing the level of being catastrophic. By all accounts, his shell should have already come undone, but Sunny had submerged so deeply into the sensation of being a serpent that his absolute belief held it together. Still, he felt the shadows part before the sharp blade of the Leviathan's fin, opening a straight path to the tiny incarnation hidden within them. Death was swiftly approaching, but, at the same time, he felt the spine of the azure serpent shattering as his fangs sank into the sweet marrow. The mad beast convulsed and let out a roar of blind agony. However, just like Sunny, it did not know surrender. It only had murder on its mind, and so the vice of its coils only grew stronger, crushing and slicing the hateful worm with unquenchable wrath. It was only a matter of moments now before Sunny's defenseless shadow form would be destroyed. Death. He did not know if he had called upon his enemy's death or greeted his own. For a split second, the shadow flame billowing from his mangled body ignited with startling intensity. In Sunny's mind, everything disappeared. The only thing that remained was an imperative resolve to kill the enemy. His jaw snapped shut with a deafening clap. In the next moment, there was nothing but pain. Sunny lost his sight, his hearing, his smell, his sense of touch. Even shadow sense was gone, leaving him in an empty abyss where the only thing that existed was agony. All his thoughts were incinerated, and all his awareness was banished by torment. He couldn't even scream, because he had forgotten how. But, despite all that, he was satisfied. He was thrilled. He was happy. I killed it, right? There was no way to know. But then, as if to answer his faint plea, a familiar voice whispered,
Dawn of the Twilight Sea.
The whispers flowed into his soul as darkness encroached on his mind. Left. We. Hinda. As the dark island swayed under the assault of furious waves, two broken silhouettes could be seen in the raging water, slowly drifting apart. One, much larger one, had a harrowing wound on its neck. Its spine was entirely snapped, and it was partially beheaded. A fire of indescribable madness was slowly fading away from the Leviathan's damaged eye, which was locked on the unmoving figure of the enemy even in death. The body of the azure serpent was slowly disappearing in the beautiful shine of the glowing waters as it fell into the depths. The other, smaller silhouette was torn and ravaged beyond recognition. The serpentine body of the onyx beast was cut and broken, with harrowing wounds gaping across its entire length. It seemed to be on the verge of dissolving into a swarm of intangible shadows. Before Before it did, however, a graceful figure in a fluttering white tunic dove from the high slope of the island and plunged into the raging waves. Struggling against the furious current, Nephis endured the pain of her flaw and swam toward the onyx serpent. Chapter 1280, Beauty and the Beast. Sunny was drowning in a sea of pain. His mind, what little of it was left, had become faint and fragile, ready to collapse at any moment. But it had not collapsed yet. Actually, there was a piece of good news, too. The fact that he was capable of feeling pain meant that he was still alive. The fact that he was still alive meant that the azure serpent was dead. Otherwise, it would have finished Sunny off already. I won. It was a small consolation. The pain was so unbearable that he almost wished for death. However, Sunny was too attached to life to throw it away. If there was the tiniest chance to survive, he was going to desperately cling to it with everything he had. Before, he would have done it simply out of spite, but now there were things he cherished and goals he wished to achieve. He really wanted to live. What the hell is happening? It was hard to form legible thoughts, but he somehow managed to evaluate his current state. Overwhelming pain, the loss of all senses. He was in shock. He was in a pain shock due to his shadow incarnation receiving severe damage. His soul had been wounded terribly, which meant what? He didn't know. What was he supposed to do? Was there anything to do? It hurts. For now, Sunny decided to do his best to endure the pain and hold his crumbling mind together. It wasn't easy, or pleasant, or possible, but he persisted. He persisted with everything he had, and, after an eternity of torment, there was finally a change. Sunny seemed to regain his hearing. The first thing he heard was Neff's distorted cry. "Sunny, don't die, please." He was strangely annoyed. Crap, that was an order, wasn't it? She broke her promise. Not that it could change anything. It would have been great if Nephis giving him an order to survive magically restored his body and healed his wounds. But Sunny had to be able to execute a command for Shadow Bond to compel him into action, or inaction. So, if Nephis suddenly decided to order him to go and bring her the moon one day, at most he would be forced to fruitlessly try his best. And he was already trying his best to survive. No, really, who does she take me for? Nephis had been the one who called him a cockroach in the first place. As a compliment. Of course, he would do everything in his power to remain alive. There was no need to shout. Sunny slowly realized that his thoughts were becoming longer and more cohesive. Something is changing. Slowly, his senses returned, one after another. Hearing was first, followed by shadow sense of touch, smell, taste, and finally sight. It was all a proper mess, though. His vision was blurry, and his other senses were going haywire. There was more pain, too, this time of a physical nature. Why am I even feeling physical pain? I am a manifested shadow right now. Technically, perhaps it was a phantom pain. Even though Sunny did not possess a human body at the moment, his mind was still that of a human, and when his mind perceived the dreadful damage done to his shadow body, it reacted the only way it knew how, by panicking and drowning itself in pain. Curses. Sunny gritted his teeth and was startled by the fact that he had regained the ability to grit his teeth. Even more surprising was the fact that it was fangs and not teeth that he was grinding against each other. His shell seemed to have held together, somehow. Finally, he became lucid enough to understand the situation. The tumultuous waters of the great river were suffused with a soft radiance, indicating that it was still night. More than that, he judged that less than a minute had passed since his final clash with the Azure Serpent, with Darren of the Twilight Sea. He knew that because the colossal corpse of the ferocious great beast could still be seen, barely, as it slowly sank into the depths of the river. The frightening silhouette of the ancient Leviathan grew smaller as it fell into the unfathomable depths and dissolved in the beautiful glow. A complicated mix of emotions rose in Sunny's heart when he saw his enemy dead. There was dark glee, a strange hint of sorrow, respect, contempt, hatred, curiosity, suspicion. There was also a strong feeling of regret. That was a supreme soul shard disappearing into the depths, after all. He groaned. Turning his attention away from the body of the slain Leviathan, Sunny tried to understand what was happening around him. He perceived his long serpentine body, now mangled and savagely ripped apart. It felt weak, understandably so, but also weaker than that. The soul flame. The soul flame was gone. He was only augmented by the 5 shadows now. Finally, Sunny noticed Nephis. Her small figure was on top of him. She must have climbed onto his giant body while he was floating lifelessly in the water, paralyzed by pain and on the verge of losing consciousness. Both of her palms were pressed against broken onyx scales, and her skin was shining with soft white radiance. She must have retrieved her flames. Nephis was healing him. But, suddenly, her radiant figure exploded with light, dispelling the darkness of the night like an actual star. Sunny felt the familiar warmth, now much more intense than it had ever been before, flowing into him like a flood, and, embraced by that warmth, his broken form started to restore itself. As he felt it, startled, his deeply wounded soul was healed. His half-destroyed shadow incarnation was restored to a pristine state. And, shockingly, even his serpentine shell knitted itself back together. The harrowing wounds closed. The shattered onyx scales glued themselves back together. By the time Neph's radiance wavered and fell, Sunny was as good as new. The pain that had been tormenting him receded, then disappeared completely. He was alive again. Nephis fell powerlessly on his wide back. She remained motionless for a few moments, then dragged her body up and clutched to two of the horn-like spikes growing from the crown of his head, where the dorsal fin ended. Right, the azure serpent was dead, but they were still far from being safe. In fact, they were in mortal peril, much more so than when the great beast had been alive. It was because there was no one to stop the dark butterfly from conquering the carcass of the black turtle anymore. Worse than that, the abominable creature had surely noticed a blinding star suddenly igniting in the darkness of the night. It was bound to descend upon them at any moment. So, it was time for the second part of the plan. We actually made it so far, huh? It was time to leave the dark island behind and run. Let's go, Neph. Dismissing Saint, Sunny spent a split second to gather the strength permeating the vast expanse of his mighty serpentine body. Then, with Nephis on his back, he lowered his head and dove into the endlessly flowing, radiant waters of the great river. Chapter 1281, Leaving the Dark Island. Sunny dove into the shining depths of the great river. His serpentine body was like a spear carved from black onyx, cutting through the radiant water with stunning, terrible speed. It was made to rule the sea, so no ship or vessel could compete with him in the deep. A great monster, though. Even though the dark butterfly was an aerial abomination, it had shown a dreadful ability to fight the azure serpent underwater with strange ease. They needed to escape being noticed by it, and so Sunny swam down. Nephis had the essence pearl, so he was not afraid of pulling her so deep that she would drown. That said, he was afraid of the depths. There was no telling what was hiding at the bottom of the great river. What kind of horrors lived there? Did time exist there, and if so, what was its flow? Sunny did not know, and he wasn't ready to find out. The plan they had concocted was to dive deep enough to avoid the notice of the dark butterfly, and then travel downstream, gradually returning to the surface. He saw no reason to change it. As the onyx serpent moved down into the flowing abyss with a fragile human figure clutching to his horns, the dark island slowly disappeared in the distance. Its ominous silhouette was consumed by the radiance of the water, and soon there was nothing around them but shining emptiness. Sunny felt a strange melancholy brush against his heart and steeled himself. They had finally escaped from the shell of the black turtle. That place, it had given him the peace and comfort he so desperately needed after the disastrous resolution of the dreadful and bitterly long southern campaign. For a while, it was like a paradise, but that paradise was a dark one. In the end, it had turned into a death trap, and now they were leaving both the paradise and the trap behind. Don't look back. He refused to. There were, without a doubt, a lot of much more harrowing obstacles waiting for them ahead, and, hopefully, at the end of them all, they would be able to find a new paradise of their own. Sunny carried Nephis deeper and deeper into the great river. Slowly, the radiance of the water grew brighter, its flow more tumultuous, and the pressure assaulting them heavier. Knowing that his serpentine shell was much more resilient than Neph's body, he hesitated to go any further. It was enough, anyway. If the dark butterfly was going to pursue them, it would have already plunged into the river and attacked. A powerful sense of relief flooded his mind. Thank the gods. Sunny barely survived a battle with a great beast, and that was mostly due to the fact that the azure serpent had already been wounded, exhausted, and close to death. Fighting a great monster immediately after that battle would have surely been the end of him. Twisting his giant body, Sunny slowed their descent and then pushed forward. His already tremendous speed increased even more when he started to move with the current. It was to such a degree that Nephis struggled to hold on to his horns, despite her ascended strength. But there was no helping it. Now that they had escaped the dark island and the monstrous butterfly, another challenge lay in front of them, one that was perhaps even harder to overcome. That challenge was the expanse of the great river itself. There was no point in leaving the dark island if all that awaited them was a slow, agonizing death. There were harrowing abominations of all kinds dwelling both in the water and in the boundless sky. Without anywhere to find shelter, doom was all but guaranteed. They might escape it once or twice, perhaps even a dozen times, but sooner or later, exhaustion would overwhelm them, and their luck would run out. Then, the great river would become their grave. That was why Sunny and Nephis had a clear goal in mind. They had to travel downstream, as far into the past as they could, and discover the ancient people who had entered the tomb of Ariel thousands of years ago. Sunny was incredibly swift while encased in the shell of the onyx serpent. He could cover a great distance in a short amount of time, traveling much further than the carcass of the black turtle had been pulled by the current in an entire month. The problem was essence. Existing as a shadow incarnation was consuming his essence, and sustaining the massive shape of the river serpent was consuming it as well. He had already spent a lot of essence fighting the mad Leviathan, and although Neep's flame was enhancing his soul to a degree, his reserves were not infinite. Even though he was a tyrant, they were not at all adequate for the task at hand. And so, Sunny had to hurry. He had to squeeze all the speed he could muster from his serpentine form while he could. If his essence ran out before they found land, or anything at all to climb onto, there would be no choice but to remain drifting in the water, slowly recovering their powers and hoping desperately that nothing would attack them in the meantime. The dwellers of the deep, the swarms of abominable krill, the flying predators that hunted creatures inhabiting the river, he didn't think that they would live long enough for their essence to be replenished. Praying that something appeared on the horizon, Sunny flew through the shining water. His powerful body cut through the flowing abyss, leaving a trail of raging turbulence in its wake. Nephis clung desperately to his horns, exhausted by the explosion of healing flames she had created earlier to save him, and the harrowing pain of having to use her aspect for so long, and with such intensity. Strangely enough, Sunny had ended up in a better state than her, despite being the one who had fought in the battle with the azure serpent. The longer they swam, the more worried about her he became. But he was tired too. His wounds might have healed, but the terrible mental exhaustion remained, smothering his ability to remain clear-headed and strive forward without rest. Slowly, a cold lethargy was seeping into his mind. Struggling against it, he continued to swim forward. Chapter 1282 to 1282, Currents of Time. Sunny did not know how far, exactly, they had traveled away from the dark island, but the distance had to be immense. His shadow shell was not only enormous, it was also created to reign in the water. Considering that he was moving with the current of the great river, his already great speed was enhanced even more. So, he decided that it would be safe to rise to the surface. Gradually ascending, he tore through the radiant abyss and finally raised his head above the glistening waves. Still clinging to his horns, Nephis slumped down and breathed heavily. It had been hard for her to withstand the resistance of the water, which had been battering her like a ram for so long. The greater Sunny's speed was, the greater was the resistance. She had already been exhausted by straining her ability beyond its limit, and enduring the feverish race through the depths could not have been easy. But now that the onyx serpent's head was above water, Nephis could finally rest a little. The sky was still impenetrably black. A soft glow was rising from the river, illuminating the vast emptiness of its flowing expanse. The view was as dreamlike and magical as it had been on the first day Sunny had seen it, but his heart was pierced by despair. It was because even now, after leaving the dark islands so far behind, he couldn't see any hint of land anywhere around them. An old doubt crawled into his mind, sapping strength from his tired body. What if there is no land? What if this whole world is nothing but water? Gritting his fangs, Sunny let out a quiet growl and strained every fiber of his shell to accelerate even more. With his onyx snout as the spearhead and his black dorsal fin as a sharp blade, he cut the glowing surface of the great river. Faster, faster, he was not out of essence yet. There was a certain sense of exhilaration he felt, flying toward the horizon with terrible speed. The speed, the might of his shell, the slender weight of Neph's body pressing down on his scales, and the empty vastness of the boundless black sky, it was almost liberating. But, at the same, his heart was drowning in anxiety, fear, and dread, and soon he was proven right to be afraid. Sunny felt an ominous premonition and rose his head a little higher above the water. In the next moment, his serpentine eyes narrowed. There, ahead of them, the surface of the great river was seething and boiling. A boundless krill swarm was swiftly moving to meet them, hundreds of thousands of corrupted beasts burning with a mad desire to devour the onyx serpent and his rider alive. Sunny's enormous body shuddered. but he tried to remain calm. This is not the end. The krill swarm was a harrowing foe, but the terror of it lay in how numerous the river locusts were. The hungry legion rushing towards Sunny was the largest he had ever seen by far, enough so that even the azure serpent might have been unable to prevail against it. However, unlike the ancient Leviathan, Sunny was not constrained by the need to defend his prey, and while the krill were numerous, they were not individually strong. Much more importantly, they were not too fast. Cutting a sharp turn, Sunny roared and flew west, parallel to the approaching mass of abominations. His feverish thoughts dissolved into a simple, bestial need to outrun the swarm. The distance between them grew smaller with frightening speed, and yet he still couldn't see the edge of the vast patch of rough water. And by the time he saw it, there was no time left. Damn it! As Nephis picked herself up and summoned a sword, Sunny plunged into the mass of krill. The water surged around him, creating a barrier, but more than a few abominations passed through it. His jaws snapped, and Neph's sword flashed. A few moments later, they broke the wall of river locusts and tore free of the swarm. Sunny had just barely reached the edges of the rough water patch, and even though they had to go through the krill at the very end, the expanse of the great river in front of them was clear. Sunny swam with all his might, skirting the pursuing swarm and increasing the distance between the slithering locusts and his tail. Faster, faster, faster. Soon the krill were left far behind. Nephis slumped again, clutching her sword with a trembling hand. He did not have a lot of essence left. They continued to move downstream, covering a tremendous distance. The onyx serpent flew like an arrow, much faster than any arrow could fly. But that was still not enough. After the first swarm, there was another. After the second swarm, there was a harrowing creature that lunged at them from the depths. After the creature, there was a gargantuan mass of rotting seaweed that almost ensnared and devoured them. A dozen grotesque maws suddenly appearing from beneath the swaying weeds. And after that, there were more horrors than he could count. Flocks of predatory birds that seemed to have pearls growing in their desiccated flesh, invisible creatures that were able to instantly turn large spans of the river into adamantine ice, ghostly lights that burned in the depths of the water, filling their minds with an indescribable desire to approach them. But Sunny was a river serpent, a monarch among beasts. His long body was fast, mighty, and tenacious. He was incredibly fast and at home in the water. He had outrun the krill, tore through the rotting seaweed, dove into the depths to avoid the birds of prey, broke through the ice, resisted the allure of the ghostly lights. He had escaped from them all. However, his essence was running dry. It was almost gone. He was exhausted and well past the limits of his mental strength, and there was still no land in sight. By the time the seven suns slowly appeared from beyond the horizon, chasing away the impenetrable darkness, and the great river stopped shining, he was utterly spent. It was not even a matter of willpower anymore. It was simply a matter of not having anything else to give. His essence was fully depleted. Finally, despair consumed his heart. The shadow shell was the first to crumble. The mighty onyx serpent shuddered and then dissolved into shadows, which were instantly chased away by the pale light of dawn. His incarnation disappeared next. Sunny turned intangible and was then thrown out of the embrace of the shadows, finally regaining his human form. He was in pain. Every muscle in his body felt like it was about to burst. His lungs felt as if they were consumed by fire. His head was heavy, and his limbs were weak. He even failed to adapt to the change in time, swallowing a mouthful of water. Which was fine. He was dying from thirst anyway. Sunny felt himself sinking, and struggled weakly to stay afloat. But even that was too much of a strain. Am I going to drown? A moment later, a strong arm embraced him, and he felt Nephis pressing his body against hers. Swimming with the help of her one free hand, she pulled them both upward. Soon, their heads broke the surface of the water. Sunny was momentarily blinded by sunlight and coughed, trying to push air into his lungs. Over. It's over. We won't survive the few days needed for our essence to recover. As he tried to think of something, anything, that could keep them alive, a strange shiver suddenly ran through Neph's body. Since she was still hugging him from behind, he could feel it clearly. Sunny. Sunny. He tried to answer, and was suddenly struck by the strangeness of his human body. It felt alien and tiny, not at all befitting a ferocious serpent like him. He had forgotten how to talk. Snap out of it, damn it. Sunny slowly gathered his senses, remembering what it meant to be human. Then, he moved his unfamiliar tongue and said hoarsely, What? Nephis moved, turning them both to face downstream. Her voice was just as hoarse as his. There, he frowned, following the direction where her finger was pointing with his gaze, and then froze. There, on the water, no more than 100 meters away, a small boat was swaying on the waves, both of its sails lowered. It was made out of beautiful dark wood, with intricate patterns carved along its sides. There was no movement inside, but the boat seemed to be staying in place, strangely unaffected by the strong current of the great river. And so, they were being slowly pulled in its direction. Chapter 1283, Catch. A small wooden vessel was resting on the sparkling water. The 7 suns were rising from the distant depths, and the world was painted in the lilac hues of early dawn. Illuminated by that beautiful light, the vessel seemed like an illusion. What is this? His hoarse voice was full of disbelief. It was just too improbable to find an empty boat swaying gently on the waves just when his essence had run out and despair had taken hold of his heart. The great river was inconceivably vast, and yet they had just happened to find themselves a mere 100 meters away from a boat at that exact moment. Even when was involved, the coincidence seemed too convenient. It was to such a degree that Sunny even considered that he was hallucinating. Wouldn't be the first time anyway. Maybe the Sin of Solace had learned a new trick. However, Nephis saw the boat too. She hesitated for a moment, then said numbly, "It's a ketch." Sunny was about to ask what the word ketch meant, but he was too tired for unnecessary questions. It was probably a type of boat, regardless. Nephis knew about these things, considering that she had even built one for them, back on the Forgotten Shore. It was probably also a part of her legacy training. The two of them remained still for a few seconds, then swam toward the ketch. Well, Nephis was the only one swimming while supporting Sunny. He just weakly moved his legs to help her a little. Soon they reached it. Sunny placed his palm on the hull of the sailboat, still unsure if it was real. However, the dark wood felt smooth and solid to his touch. He traced his hand across it, both stunned and relieved. It might be a trap. Even if it was, they had no choice but to climb into the ketch. It was too small to protect them from great abominations like the azure serpent, but anything was better than nothing. More than that, the ketch couldn't be as simple as it looked. It was drifting in the harrowing waters of the great river without a scratch on its hull, after all. A mundane boat would have been destroyed in a matter of hours here. Even the piece of flotsam that Sunny had once used as a raft, which was tough enough to withstand the nails of a master, was turned into tiny splinters. It had to have been a part of a large vessel before turning into flotsam too, and that mysterious vessel had ended up being destroyed. Plus, the ketch was not really drifting. It was staying in place, unaffected by the current of time. So, it was certainly special in some way. A tentative spark of hope ignited in Sunny's heart. Despite the modest size of the wooden sailboat, its sides were too tall for them to simply climb over them, especially in their weakened state. However, a rope ladder was conveniently lowered into the water near the bow of the ketch, as if inviting them in. Sunny and Nephis glanced at each other. His paranoia was acting up, not without a reason, and from the looks of it, she felt the same way. But there was no decision to make. Since salvation miraculously presented itself, they would be fools not to accept the unexpected gift. Nephis pushed Sunny toward the ladder, and then helped him climb up. Falling over the side of the ketch, Sunny sprawled on the wooden floor. The feeling of something solid under him was both unfamiliar and heavenly. The gentle swaying of the boat was like a lullaby. A moment later, Nephis awkwardly climbed over the rim and tumbled down, landing squarely on top of him. Sunny let out a weak groan. Ow! They remained motionless for a few moments, catching their breaths, then slowly extricated themselves from each other and took a cautious look around. The ketch was not too big, about 7 meters long. Its layout was very simple. There was only a single deck, with no roofed interior or cabins. The deck was completely open, with 2 masts, a longer one and a shorter one, rising into the air like slender, dark pillars. Everything was made with a mundane but exquisite level of craftsmanship. The wooden surfaces were tastefully engraved, showing all sorts of flowing images, now smoothed out by the wind, water, and passage of time. The ketch seemed like the loving creation of a supremely skilled artisan, even if it had seen better days. One look was enough to tell that the wooden boat was very old. However, it had been maintained with the utmost care, remaining in near-perfect condition. Sunny was musing about who could have taken care of the ketch when his gaze finally reached the stern, where the steering oar was supposed to be. Unlike the chain breaker, there was no runic circle for the helmsman. Instead, there was only a very mundane wooden bench, and there, on that bench, a corpse was sitting with its head hung low. His body suddenly grew stiff. What? Sunny was momentarily paralyzed by shock, because that corpse, it looked eerily familiar. It was shrouded in a dark mantle, which made it hard to determine whether the body belonged to a man or a woman. All that he could see was that the person was of small stature and terribly thin. Their long white hair moved slightly in the wind, and the face was obscured by a mask of black lacquered wood. The mask was carved to resemble the face of a ferocious demon. Its teeth were bared, with 4 fangs protruding from its mouth, and there were 3 twisted horns rising from it like a crown. Inside the black chasms of its eyes, there was nothing but pure darkness. It was Weaver's mask, and the corpse was just like the one he had found beneath the ruined cathedral of the Dark City, all those years ago. Chapter 1284, Hail Weaver. Sunny found himself unable to move for a few moments. Encountering the Ketch just when they desperately needed shelter was already shocking enough. Finding a corpse that looked eerily similar to the nameless prisoner of the hidden dungeon beneath the ruined cathedral inside the Ketch, it sent him into a fugue state. All kinds of wild thoughts rushed through his mind. For a split second, Sunny even imagined that it was his own corpse, brought here from the future by some strange anomaly of the mystical river. But, no, the proportions were all wrong. He was not a tall man, but the mysterious person was even smaller. They were practically tiny. In fact, now that Sunny had taken a good look at the corpse, he realized that it was different from the prisoner of the ruined cathedral as well. The dark mantle and the mask were the same, but the body hidden beneath them was not. Even with its features obfuscated, he could tell the difference. Still, what was the meaning of this? How could there be another Weaver's mask? Who were these 2 people, and how could they be so similar despite the great divide between the Dark City and the tomb of Ariel? Nephis seemed startled as well, albeit for a different reason than Sunny. She did notice his strong reaction though. Sunny? What is it? She must have noticed that the mask the corpse was wearing was the same mask Mongrel wore. She also knew that it was a divine memory of the 7th tier, even if Sunny had never told her where Weaver's mask came from. He took a deep breath. That corpse, it's just like the one I found in the Dark City, beneath the cathedral. That was where I got the mask. Sunny had found the spawn of the vile thieving bird by pure coincidence, even if that coincidence might not have happened without the influence of Heimdall. Everything that followed after absorbing the drop of ichor that contained Bloodweave, however, was the result of logic and reason. It was the consequence of that first chance encounter. Guided by the ability to see the radiance of divinity which Bloodweave granted him, he explored the cathedral of the Dark City and received Weaver's mask. Guided by Weaver's mask, he dove into the sky below, reached the ebony tower, and discovered Weaver's severed arm, thus acquiring Boneweave. What was the cause of this situation then? Was it a coincidence or the result of his choices? As Sunny was spacing out, consumed by these thoughts, Nephis looked at him with a frown. Corpse? What do you mean? He shivered. Could she not see the hunched figure sitting on the helmsman's bench? He took a step forward and pointed with a hurried motion. That. Don't you see that corpse? Nephis seemed both wary and slightly confused. Of course I see that person. It's just that, why do you keep calling them a corpse? That person is alive. Sunny eyes widened, and in the next moment, the corpse moved. With a deep sigh, its hanging head rose, and 2 dark chasms carved into the fearsome mask stared at Sunny with an ineffable emotion. Then, the corpse slowly, arduously stood up. No, not the corpse, the person. The wearer of Weaver's mask was, indeed, alive. Sunny watched silently, unable to move. Only his hand stretched out a little, ready to summon a weapon. Once the owner of the Ketch rose to their feet, he realized that they were indeed very small. The figure shrouded by the dark mantle was extremely thin, seeming weak and frail. The person's back was hunched, and their hands seemed to be shaking slightly. It was no surprise that Sunny had mistaken the wearer of the mask for a corpse, with the person remaining utterly motionless and his perception painted by the encounter in the dungeon of the ruined cathedral. It would have been strange for him to assume that they were alive. The hunched stranger froze, looking at them through the lightless pits of the black lacquered mask's eyes. Sunny and Nephis weren't moving either, not knowing what to do. They had just unceremoniously climbed into this person's boat, so So, what was there to do? Ask politely to be saved? Or attack them out of fear? Sunny secretly shifted his gaze, trying to determine whether the wearer of the mask was a human or a nightmare creature. However, just like with the corpse beneath the cathedral, the dark mantle and the mask were impenetrable. Beyond them lay an unknowable abyss. An icy chill crept up his spine. Then, the owner of the ketch slowly raised their hands, which were wrapped in black gloves. The thin fingers touched the edges of the black lacquered mask and slowly pulled it down. The face that was revealed belonged to a human. She was an old, extremely old woman. Sunny had never seen anyone who looked so ancient. He couldn't quite believe that someone that aged could still be alive. Her tan skin was covered in a spider web of deep, cavernous wrinkles and clung to her emaciated face like fragile paper. Her long hair was entirely white and thin, revealing glimpses of the brown parchment of her scalp. Her eyes, which had been piercing once, were now dull and obscured by milky cataracts. The old woman's small, hunched body was frail and thin, as if ready to collapse from the smallest gale. The dark mantle hung listlessly from it, a few sizes too big. Nevertheless, she was emanating a feeling of unimpeachable dignity, willpower, and sanctity, even. The black mask fell to the deck of the ketch with a wooden clack. The old woman was looking at Sunny and Nephis silently, one moment passing after another, and then she moved. Bending down, she groaned and slowly kneeled. Sunny was startled, but most of all he felt a strong urge to jump forward and stop her. It felt incredibly wrong to see such an old woman prostrating herself, let alone in front of him. He noticed Neff's back growing stiff as she felt the same. The corner of her eye twitched, but neither of them moved. Finally, the old woman's knees touched the deck. Placing both hands in front of her, she took a shaky breath and then kowtowed deeply. Her quiet voice sounded like a scraping quill. Hearing it, Sunny flinched. She said, "Hail, Weaver, demon of fate." In the silence that followed, he hesitated for a while and then answered, "Firstborn of the unknown." The old woman remained motionless for a few moments and then let out a long sigh. Lowering her head even closer to the deck, she spoke with reverence. "Ananke greets the children of Weaver." Chapter 1285, Ananke. Ananke greets the children of Weaver. The word hung in the air. Sunny and Nephis glanced at each other warily, both confused by this strange situation. Why was the old woman prostrating in front of them? Why had she addressed them as children of Weaver? What is going on? Sunny was tired out of his mind, and the inexplicable nature of the strange old woman was simply too much for him to process. She didn't seem hostile, at least. With a sigh, he allowed his exhausted body to collapse and sat down on the wooden deck of the ketch. Nephis, meanwhile, hesitated for a few moments, then took several steps forward and carefully pulled the old woman up. "Please rise, grandmother. Do not bow on our account." The owner of the ketch, Ananke, allowed herself to be gently pulled into a sitting position. Then Nephis returned to Sunny and sat side by side with him. The two of them were now facing the old woman, waiting for her to say something, but she remained silent. After a few moments passed, Sunny frowned. He felt nervous. There was no telling just how powerful this woman was and what her intentions were. Ananke was a complete mystery. She could also provide answers to many mysteries that had plagued him. So, he asked, "I am sorry, grandmother, but why did you call us the children of Weaver?" There were many questions he wanted to ask, but this one was the most pressing. Its answer could explain how old Ananke would treat them. The old woman took a deep sigh, then spoke in her thin, creaky voice. "Because you are the chosen of the nightmare spell. You are a miracle. Your existence is Weaver's triumph." A proud smile appeared on her lips. It was warm and almost motherly, as though she was indeed a grandmother looking at her young, beautiful grandchildren. Sunny took a deep breath, feeling embarrassed. Weaver's triumph. He was all but certain that the nightmare spell had been created by the demon of fate. Now, the last tiny sliver of doubt had disappeared. Weaver was indeed the being responsible for the great calamity that had befallen Earth, or maybe for its salvation. Regardless, old Ananke seemed to have a deep connection to Weaver and the nightmare spell. She was also, most likely, one of the people they had wanted to find, a native inhabitant of the Great River, one of the ancient people who had entered the tomb of Ariel before the gods fell. But wouldn't it mean that she had come to the Great River before the spell was created? Things were still not making any sense. As if reading his thoughts, Nephis leaned forward and asked as politely as she could, "Forgive me for asking, but who are you, grandmother?" Ananke smiled. What she said next made both Sunny and Nephis flinch. I am Ananke, the priestess of the nightmare spell. In the silence that followed, the old woman gently shook her head. It must be hard for you to imagine, my lord and lady. You come from a time when the nightmare spell has matured and rules unopposed, its blessings given freely to all. But it wasn't always like that. At the beginning, which was also the end, when the nightmare spell was still in its infancy, there was a need for people like me to tend to it, protect it, and above all, to help it spread, so that it could grow stronger. Her wrinkled face grew somber, and a heavy sigh escaped from her lips. Which wasn't easy at all. After all, we, the followers of a daemon, were deemed heretics and persecuted by servants of the gods. All were despised, many were hunted down and put to death. Well, not that I experienced any of that myself. Every sentence the old woman spoke was a revelation, and they followed one after another. There were so many startling pieces of information she was sharing freely with them that Sunny found himself unable to digest it all. He felt like a person who was drowning in a deep sea after spending years dying from thirst in the desert. Priestess of the nightmare spell, the beginning that was also the end, must be the early stages of the war between the demons and the gods. Wait, the spell was not created as it is today. It had to grow? Be grown even? Persecuted by the gods? What? He was failing desperately to keep up, tired as he was. Nephis was struggling too, but it seemed as though she had a slightly better grasp of the conversation. White sparks ignited in her eyes. So, our existence is proof that the suffering of the followers of Weaver was not meaningless? That the nightmare spell you worshipped and proselytized has realized its great design? Ananke nodded and looked at them with reverence, which made both feel uncomfortable. Indeed, you are very wise, my lady. Nephis remained silent for a few moments, then remarked evenly, "You don't seem to be surprised by the fact that we come from the future." Sunny forced himself to focus. It was a very poignant question, and one that he had failed to think of himself, distracted by the avalanche of revelations. The old woman slowly nodded, her breath ragged. It seemed that it was hard for her to speak for so long, but she still forced herself to answer. "Of course, I am not surprised. Haven't you come from upstream, my lord and lady?" Nephis and Sunny glanced at each other. They had indeed. The natives of the great river, which flowed from the future into the past, would have had a different perception of time. For them, people from the future might not seem that strange. Ananke took a breath, then added tiredly, "Oh, but I was also warned that you would come." Huh? That was perhaps the most shocking revelation yet. After a moment of silence, Sunny raised an eyebrow while hiding how shaken he truly was. Warned? How? The old woman nodded again, her unbound white hair moving in the wind. "I received a message in my dreams, a message that the children of Weaver would come, and that—" She paused for a few moments, catching her breath, then finished fervently, "and that I must help them reach fallen grace, where dusk, the last of the Sibyls, reigns." Chapter 1286, Fortuitous Encounter. Dusk. Sibyl of the Fallen Grace. Sunny shivered. Of course, he remembered who Dusk was. He was wearing a tunic called Shroud of Graceless Dusk, after all, the transcendent memory of the 6th tier he had received for slaying the terror of LO-49. That damned horror. If he were to try and assign numbers to the enemies he had faced in Antarctica based on how many mental scars they left him with, the beautiful flower of floating white silk would be squarely placed second, right behind the winter beast. Even Goliath, who had literally killed him, did not leave as harrowing of an impression. Of course, Dusk was most likely neither dead nor corrupted yet in the nightmare. She was still a human, and seemed to be ruling a place called Fallen Grace. Since Sunny and Nephis wanted to reach the civilization of the Great River and find the Sibyls, this destination was perfect. It was a little bit too perfect, even. Ananke had answered one of the most important questions they had. The improbable coincidence of them finding her catch just when they needed it was no coincidence at all. She had come knowingly, expecting to find them. But who was it that had instructed her where to find them? In her dreams, no less. Who was pulling the strings of this nightmare behind the scenes? Is it, perhaps, the last Sibyl herself? Sunny frowned, knowing that he would not find the answer anytime soon. The earliest opportunity was probably going to be when he came face to face with the Sibyl of the Fallen Grace again. He sighed. Fallen Grace? How far is that? Old Ananke hesitated for a few moments. It is far. Very, very far. So far that I won't be able to guide you all the way there. She grew silent, her eyes closing slightly. It almost seemed as though she had dozed off. Then, however, the old woman shook slightly and added, "But I will take you as far as I can go, my lord and lady. You see, we demon followers weren't welcome here in Ariel's tomb either. They chased us away, and we traveled upstream for a long time before settling down and building Weave. It's one of the human cities on the Great River, like Fallen Grace. Or, at least, it used to be. Sunny and Nephis looked at each other. Why was it that Ananke was unable to return downstream? Was there some kind of internal strife between the locals of the Great River? Would it be dangerous for her to enter the waters controlled by the Sibyls? And what did she mean, that Weave only used to be a city? Nephis spoke cautiously. We wouldn't want to put you in danger, grandmother. The old woman smiled. Helping you is both my wish and privilege, my lady. Do not worry about me. I am of the Great River. Her speech was slowing down, and her words became slurred. It was obvious that the old woman was growing too tired to continue the conversation. She seemed to have understood that too. With a soft sigh, Ananke raised her hands. In the next moment, Sunny and Nephis both stared in bewilderment as a whirlwind of white sparks appeared in the air. She is summoning a memory. This action, which was so mundane and familiar to them, looked infinitely strange and out of place when performed by one of the ancient humans. It was the ability of those infected by the spell, after all, and no one they had met in all the nightmares possessed it. Soon, a wooden box appeared on the deck in front of them. Ananke opened it with shaking hands and took out several items: a beautifully embroidered tablecloth, a carafe of wine, a painted ceramic teapot with steam rising from its spout, 2 small cups, and 2 plates, one full of ripe fruits, the other full of small savory pies. The fruits were succulent, and the pies looked freshly cooked. The items were simple and modest, even worn out a little, yet lovingly maintained. A delicious smell spread through the air. Ananke carefully placed everything on the tablecloth and offered the food to Sunny and Nephis. My lord, my lady, you must be tired after braving the horrors of the future. Please, eat and rest. I will guide us back to Weave first. She took a deep breath, then slowly rose to her feet and walked back to the helmsman's bench with effort. Sitting down on it, the old woman tiredly lowered her head and whispered several strange, unintelligible words. In the next moment, the ketch suddenly moved. The midnight-colored sails rose by themselves and billowed in the wind, while the steering oar swayed, turning the bow of the boat downstream. Soon they were sailing across the sparkling expanse of the great river, slowly gaining speed. Sunny and Nephis hesitated for a bit. Both of them were completely exhausted and incredibly hungry, but they still did not trust the old woman. What if the food was poisoned? What if she was waiting until they fell asleep to kill them? Sunny glanced at the frail figure of the priestess. She looked too fragile and weak to pose any threat to them. Of course, looks could be deceiving, but he also felt that Ananke had been sincere and treated them with nothing except great benevolence. It was hard to dislike or distrust the kind, earnest old woman. Whatever. Even if she had done something to the food, he was very hard to poison. Bloodweave made him all but immune to most toxins, after all. Shaking off the mad desire to devour everything in sight, the faint remnant of the ferocious form of the river serpent, he tentatively picked up a savory pie, still warm from the oven, and took a bite. His hand trembled. Delicious, so delicious. Not wasting any more time, Sunny sent the whole pie into his mouth and chewed greedily. A few moments later, he raised his thumb and nudged Nephis with his elbow. She lingered for a moment, then followed his example. They ate and drank like 2 kids being spoiled by their grandmother, oblivious to everything else. Soon, the entire meal disappeared. They didn't even spare the wine. After that, Sunny felt incredibly sleepy. But it wasn't the unnatural feeling of having been drugged. It was simply the natural reaction of his abused body demanding some well-deserved and much-needed rest. Safe. We're safe, I think. Struggling to keep his eyes open, Sunny looked at Nephis. She was tired too, and yet she nodded to answer his silent question. It's all right. I'll take the first watch. You can. Before she even finished the sentence, Sunny had already dropped his head on her lap, fast asleep. Chapter 1287, Blissful Ignorance. Sunny slept like a baby. There were no nightmares haunting his dreams, and when he woke up, his heart felt strangely at peace. He remained motionless for a while, feeling the warmth of Neff's hand resting on the crown of his head. The ketch was moving swiftly across the water, carried by both the wind and the current, and the world around them was dark. It was already night. I overslept. Nephis should have woken him up. Had she gotten any rest herself? Turning his head slightly, Sunny looked up and saw her elegant jawline. She was leaning on the wooden side of the ketch, her eyes closed. Her breathing was slow and deep. She was fast asleep, so no one was keeping watch. Don't be upset with the lady, my lord. Sunny flinched slightly and glanced at the stern of the boat, where Ananke was still sitting, holding lightly to the steering oar. Her dark mantle was of the same color as the night sky, making it hard to discern where its folds ended and the night began. You both needed rest. Sunny felt very comfortable laying on Neff's lap, but he had to sit up with a reluctant sigh. Rubbing his eyes, he looked at his shadows, which were all but invisible in the darkness. None of them showed any sign of being concerned, so he judged that the old woman had not tried anything strange while they slept. Even though it would take a few more days for his reserves of essence to be fully replenished, they were not dry anymore. Due to the shroud of dusk, he also felt rested and refreshed. However, he was slightly hungry. Sunny hesitated for a few moments and then asked, "Say, you wouldn't happen to have more of those little pies?" Ananke smiled. "There should be a few left in the box. Eat well, my lord. I made them with care." Sunny noted that the wooden box was not a memory that created food, but instead a storage memory that helped keep supplies fresh. Everything inside must have been prepared by Ananke in anticipation of meeting the children of Weaver. Opening the lid, he discovered a few leftover pies, as well as more fruit and a couple other simple dishes, all perfectly fresh and preserved. It smelled so wonderful that he remained motionless for a moment, enjoying the fragrance. Misunderstanding his hesitation, the old woman spoke. "I'm sorry that I can't offer you more, my lord. It is not easy for me to procure fruit and flour these days. I hope you are not too disappointed." Sunny looked at her and smiled. "What are you talking about, grandmother? I once ate nothing but rotten devil meat for an entire month. This is nothing short of a feast." To illustrate his point, he picked up one of the pies and greedily pushed it into his mouth. Ananke tilted her head a little. "Do people still suffer from hunger in the future?" Sunny chewed for a long time before answering. The old woman clearly believed that the future was some kind of a paradise that she and the other followers of Weaver helped create. He didn't want to hurt her feelings. He shrugged. "Smart people don't. But I am not too smart myself, sadly. At least not all the time." Then, a sudden thought flashed through his mind. Sunny looked at Ananke carefully, then asked, "But what about you, grandmother? Have you eaten anything?" She was so thin and frail that he had mistaken her for a corpse not too long ago. However, she had only offered the food to them, not partaking in it herself. Ananke gently shook her head. "This body of mine does not get hungry often. I'll just catch some fish later." Sunny frowned, then took out the rest of the pies and walked over to the steering oar, offering them to her. "No, that won't do. Please eat some, too. Otherwise my teacher will give me a beating once I come back home." Teacher Julius would indeed be beside himself if he learned that Sunny stuffed his belly while an elderly woman starved herself nearby, even if that woman was just a nightmare inhabitant. More than that, just what kind of fish was she going to catch in the great river? Ananke hesitated a little, then took one of the pies with a shaking hand and smiled. "Thank you, my lord. That is enough." When he went back to the box, Neff stirred slightly and opened her eyes. She stared at her empty lap for a few moments, then looked at Sunny and blinked a couple of times. Finally, she sniffed the air and turned to the wooden box. Guided by the enticing fragrance of the freshly cooked food, her eyes glistened. The two of them had a scrumptious meal, while Ananke slowly ate her single pie. The atmosphere inside the ketch was strangely peaceful. It was as though they were sailing on a calm lake instead of the deadly expanse of the great river, where all kinds of terrifying creatures dwelled. The water was glowing with soft opalescence, while the sky was impenetrably black. The beautiful vista of the world hidden within the tomb of Ariel was as dreamlike and mystical as ever. As Sunny looked at the surface of the water, he suddenly saw its light grow dim. There was a vast, inconceivable shadow moving somewhere unfathomably deep below them, blocking off the radiance of the drowned suns with its endless expanse. For a few moments, a bleak darkness enveloped the entire span of the great river around the ketch, and then indifferently moved on. He shivered and looked at Ananke, terror hiding in his lightless eyes. The old woman calmly held the steering oar as she smiled. "Don't worry, my lord. They can't sense us." Sunny hesitated for a while, wondering if he should ask who the they she spoke of were. In the end, he remained silent. There were things that a person was better off not knowing. Sunny was not sure if he could allow himself the luxury of ignorance, but he decided to enjoy being ignorant still, at least for today. Chapter 1288, King Among Beasts. There were still a lot of questions Sunny wanted to ask Ananke, and a lot he needed to learn. But, surrounded by the silent darkness of the night, he simply listened to the gentle sound of water splashing against the hull of the swift ketch and stared at the glowing expanse of the great river without saying a word. A lot had happened yesterday, gods. Was it really just a day ago that he had fought the Azure Serpent? The fearsome battle, the frantic escape from the Dark Island. There had not been a single moment of peace for him to settle himself and contemplate these matters yet. It feels like a dream. He had really done it. He had killed a great beast. Of course, it was partly due to the blessing of Nef's soul flame, as well as the fact that the Azure Serpent had been severely weakened. And yet, was there another master in the world who could boast the same feat? Surely not. Had there ever been? Sunny shifted uncomfortably, afraid that the incredible achievement would go to his head. He almost wished to hear the biting remarks of the Sin of Solace, who never missed a chance to bring him down. The bastard was somewhere nearby, but kept out of sight. He could feel the faint presence of the hateful wraith at the edges of his consciousness. Nevertheless, it was a fact. Sunny had indeed slain the Azure Serpent, Darren of the Twilight Sea. What an unusual name for a nightmare creature. After observing the mad beast for so long, and even assuming its form, Sunny was certain that there was something special about the ferocious abomination. Now, after learning its name, he came to strongly suspect that the Azure Serpent was not an abomination at all, or at least had not always been one. Was the old snake actually a human once? Humans were all considered to be beasts by the spell, after all. A sovereign, for example, could be called a supreme beast. So what would happen if a sovereign succumbed to corruption? Looking at the radiant expanse of the great river, Sunny felt restless. There might be a simple way to find out. Closing his eyes, he dove into his soul sea. It was exactly the same as it had been before, with 5 black suns looming above the still water. Only now, after learning the truth of how the world of the great river had been created, he perceived it in a somewhat new light. A legion of shadows stood motionless in the silent darkness. Sunny still remembered the time when he could count the lifeless shadows with one hand, but there were so many of them now. Thousands. Have I really killed that many? Of course he had. From the forgotten shore to the tomb of Ariel, Sunny had lived a life of slaughter, even if it had not been of his own volition. The numbers had especially swelled during the Southern Campaign, where he had been constantly surrounded by vast hordes of rampant nightmare creatures. Most of the shadows were abominations. The Mountain King, the formless shadow of the unborn spawn of the vile thieving bird, the Forsaken Knight, the mordant mimic, the terror of LO-49, the mountainous Titan Goliath. But there were plenty of humans, too. The nameless old slaver, Harper, Horace, Castor, Pierce, the Red Priest, the War Maidens, the soldiers of the Ivory City, Knight Amaran, and the many awakened of the great clans he had killed in East Antarctica, Saint Dire Fang, and many more. There was also Solvain. 2 of her, actually, one that he had slain on the Chained Island, and the other he had slain in the Kingdom of Hope. Sunny felt bizarre every time he saw them, but he was looking for someone else right now. He first guessed that his suspicion was right, after noticing that there was no gargantuan shape of a great serpent among the shadows. And then, he finally saw him, Darren of the Twilight Sea. The Azure Serpent had, indeed, been a human once. There, in the darkness, stood the shadow of a handsome man with strong facial features and fierce, downturned eyebrows. He was tall and imposing, with broad shoulders and a strong-willed, angular face. His hair was arranged in a long braid, and he wore an archaic robe that seemed both simple and regal. The Azure Serpent, he really was a human. Sunny froze, looking at the silent shadow. His heart was in turmoil. This was the first time he had seen a human who had succumbed to corruption. And not any human, at that. A proud and mighty sovereign, an exalted being of the supreme rank. Even Solvain, who had spent thousands of years being tormented by the Wormvine, never gave up her humanity. Who was King Darren? Why had he come to the tomb of Ariel? How had he ended up losing himself in the madness and turning into an abomination, becoming no different from a mindless beast? Would Sunny end up the same, one day? A deep frown appeared on his face. Corruption. Sunny had not really faced corruption yet, only the result of corruption, those frenzied fiends humans of the waking world called nightmare creatures. However, he felt that if his power continued to grow, he would come into contact with it eventually, perhaps even inevitably. Troubling. He glanced at the shadow of Daron one last time, hesitated, and then said quietly, "Find peace within me, old snake. Your nightmare is over." The Azure Serpent had been a terrible enemy, but he had also protected Sunny and Nephis from the other horrors of the Great River. They wouldn't have been able to enjoy the blissful month on the Dark Island if not for his madness, hunger, and ferociousness. Sunny had learned a lot from the Great Serpent as well. With a sigh, he turned away and walked to stand between the 5 black suns. There was still something he needed to see. Sunny had received a memory after killing the corrupted sovereign, after all. His first memory of the supreme rank. Well, his first memory of the supreme rank that he had actually earned, as opposed to mysteriously receiving it out of nowhere. Summoning the runes, Sunny found the unfamiliar string of them and read, Memory. Memory rank. Supreme. Memory tier. I. Memory type. Tool. Chapter 1289, Crown of Twilight. A tool. Sunny wouldn't have minded receiving a weapon or an armor, but a tool could be incredibly valuable too. After all, he already had the Sin of Solace. The Jade Sword was only of the transcendent rank, but it still possessed the ability to cut the flesh of great nightmare creatures, albeit with some effort. It was just that Sunny had to create an opportunity to use that ability first. He also had the Mantle and the Shroud of Dusk, and while neither of them was durable enough to resist an attack by a creature like the Azure Serpent, that problem could be solved by not getting hit. Both the lack of a suitable weapon and the absence of suitable armor could be solved. A powerful tool, meanwhile, would give Sunny more ways to find the solution, so he was not disappointed. Feeling both the gentle swaying of the ketch and the silent stillness of his soul sea, Sunny continued to study the runes. He hoped that the description of the Crown of Twilight would answer some of his questions. It read, Memory Description. Greppingen ruled over a dying land. The king was valiant and wise. Refusing to embrace despair, he thought of an audacious plan, gathered his companions, and braved the endless desert to enter the tomb of Ariel, where the great river flowed endlessly from the future into the past. Thus the valiant king became a guide who guarded his people in their nightmares. They built a city at the edge of dawn and gathered an army to vanquish that which was defiled. However, in the end, the army was destroyed, the city was lost, and the valiant king himself succumbed to madness. Consumed by wrath and resentment, he turned into a mindless beast and roamed the great river for countless years. Nothing could withstand his hunger and fury until, one day, the Mad King met a treacherous shadow. "But what do you even know?" said the shadow. "Do you think you're so special? I know fury too. I know hunger too. I know madness too. Oh, and I've killed plenty of creatures more powerful than me too. Who are you to dare stare me down, beast? I am lost from light, who was born from the shadows. I am the rightful heir of death and the bastard son of fate. Wherever I go, ruin follows. If you had any sense, you would have run away as soon as you saw me." And, true to his word, treacherous Lost from Light battled the Mad King, eventually becoming his doom. That was how the king who had outlived his land died. Sunny blinked a couple of times. What? It seemed that the spell had really liked his recent outburst. It even included it, word for word, in the description of the Crown of Twilight. Oh no. He looked down and covered his face with a hand. So embarrassing. Had Nephis read this already? Struggling against the desire to fall through the deck of the ketch and drown, Sunny took a deep breath and concentrated on the description. There was still a lot of information contained in the glimmering runes that he needed to ponder. So, Daron came from outside the pyramid. He even fought his way through the Nightmare Desert, as opposed to entering a seed. There was no doubt about it, since those who had conquered a nightmare of a particular rank could not enter any seed of the same rank again. So a sovereign wouldn't be able to challenge a third nightmare. Well, actually, there was some doubt. Nothing about the tomb of Ariel and this particular nightmare was normal. Still, Sunny believed that he was right. Daron must have reached the Black Pyramid and entered the true Great River, as opposed to a version of it recreated by the spell. That next part, however, did not make any sense. He had become a guide who guarded his people in their nightmares? What did it mean? Sunny remained motionless for a while, then frowned. The most obvious answer was also the most confusing. The spell created nightmares based on the past. The Great River, however, existed simultaneously in the past, in the present, and in the future. So, if Daron had truly entered the real tomb of Ariel, then he would be present in any recreation of the Great River conjured by the spell. Therefore, if his subjects challenged a seed connected to the Black Pyramid, their sovereign would be waiting for them on the other side, to help them conquer it. If I am right, then it was indeed an audacious plan. There was just one glaring problem with this theory. It was that the seeds of nightmares, and the nightmares themselves, had not existed in the ancient past of the dream realm. No explorer had ever discovered signs that its human inhabitants had possessed knowledge of the nightmares, and Noctis had not known anything about them either. So how could Darren come up with a plan to use the uniqueness of the Great River to help his people transcend through a nightmare, if there were no nightmares at that time yet? Then again, Ananke was from a time when the seed of the spell had already existed. Granted, that time was at the start of the war between the demons and the gods, so Darren could not have lived much later. That war was the cataclysm that no one had escaped. So confusing. In any case, Darren's plan had failed. Although many of his people managed to join him within the tomb of Ariel, they died trying to destroy that which was defiled, whatever it was. Actually, that phrase is perhaps the most important piece of information in the entire description. It was important indeed, because it hinted at the goal of the nightmare, which also meant that Sunny, Nephis, and the other members of the cohort would have to succeed where the ancient sovereign and his army had failed. Great. Sunny felt a bit of dread at the prospect, but, at the same time, he also felt a little relieved. At least he knew now they wouldn't really need to search for the mystical estuary of the Great River in order to return to the waking world. They just had to kill something that even a sovereign had not been able to kill. He was going to have to discuss this with Nephis. In the meantime, though, he still hadn't learned what his new, shiny supreme memory could do. Looking back to the shimmering runes, he read, Memory Enchantments. Well, we're unnatural. Chapter 1290 Royal Promise. Sunny raised an eyebrow, pleasantly surprised. 3 enchantments on a memory of the first tier. That was rare. As an amateur sorcerer, he knew just how hard it was to build a varied spellweave around a single nexus. Intrigued, he continued to study the runes. Enchantment description. This memory greatly improves the rate at which the wearer's essence is replenished at the borders between day and night. Enchantment description. This memory grants the wearer complete immunity to mind attacks, but plagues them with irresistible wrath instead. Enchantment description. This memory infuses authority over water into the wearer's domain. The extent of this authority depends on the might of the domain. Sunny scratched the back of his head. The first enchantment was rather straightforward and extremely useful. Granted, that usefulness was situational. It would greatly speed up his recovery of essence at the borders between day and night, meaning dawn and dusk. The second enchantment was tricky. Complete immunity to mind attacks was an incredible trait to have, but it came at the cost of being consumed by mad fury. Sunny wasn't sure what to make of it. Luckily, it was an active enchantment, so he could use the other 2 without going berserk. But the third enchantment was simply confounding. Infuses authority over water into a domain? What? What were people like him, who didn't even have a domain, supposed to do with it? Sunny took a deep breath, then left the Soul Sea and opened his eyes. The great river was still shining softly, the flowing water foaming as it parted before the bow of the ketch. He hesitated for a few moments, then summoned the Crown of Twilight. Soon, a band of black metal shaped and engraved to resemble a river serpent appeared on his head. The weight of it felt unfamiliar, but at least it prevented his hair from getting in his eyes. That was already useful enough. It looks cool, too. Sunny lingered a little, then lowered his hand toward the surface of the river and activated the Mui. Suddenly, he felt the water responding to him. The sense of connection he felt was faint and weak, not at all like the kinship he shared with shadows, but still, a wave suddenly rose, touching his palm for a brief moment before collapsing back into the current. Sunny stared down with a strange expression. So that's how it is. The extent of the authority that granted to the master of the Crown of Twilight was dependent on the power of their domain. Sunny did not have a domain, so that extent was negligible, but it wasn't non-existent. Leaning back, he smiled slightly. Still, in a world that has nothing but water, even that much will prove endlessly useful. The ketch continued its journey, while Sunny continued to stare at the beautiful radiance of the great river. The Crown of Twilight. It was an insidiously powerful memory. At first glance, none of its enchantments seemed too staggering. However, once he thought a bit more about them, he realized how outstanding they really were. They could help him recover his essence. The effect of a supreme memory would be immense, but there was a condition: it only functioned at dawn and dusk. As a veteran of the Southern Campaign, Sunny knew better than most how important managing one's reserves of essence was. There was dawn and dusk every day too, so he would benefit greatly from improved rate of essence replenishment twice a day, every day, combined with the blessing of the Shroud of Dusk that would put him in a very advantageous position. Not to mention that here on the Great River there were places where sunrise and sunset lasted endlessly, as if frozen in time. They offered stellar defense against mind attacks, the most dreadful kind, as far as he was concerned, but would turn Sunny berserk. The benefit seemed as great as the cost was terrible, or did it? He could easily think of situations where boundless fury would only be beneficial. Wasn't it almost like a dangerous but potent boon? And lastly, the would give him a degree of control over water in a world where there was nothing but water. The value of such an ability was evident, but more than that, this enchantment also possessed the greatest capacity for growth. Sunny did not doubt that the sovereigns, the actual sovereigns of the waking world, would stop at nothing to possess a memory that could grant a second authority to their domains. Hell, since the independence of the House of Night was founded, to a large extent on the fact that it was close to impossible to conquer the Storm Sea, the Crown of Twilight could very well completely upset the balance of power between the great clans. The Ivlet would allow any sovereign to add Night's territory to their own, and yet here he was, a mere master, in possession of it. Sunny smiled. Who knows, maybe I'll be the one who conquers the House of Night. However, his smile quickly disappeared. Right now, even his chances of surviving the third nightmare seemed incredibly bleak. In case he did manage to return home, nothing would ever compel him to attempt the fourth. Nothing. Yeah, thanks but no thanks. Somewhat sober now, Sunny sighed and dismissed the Crown of Twilight. There was something else he had to think about. The battle with the Azure Serpent had been like a feverish dream. He had turned into a mad beast to fight the great abomination, but he had also managed to remain himself. More than that, it was the first time he had succeeded in using Shadow Shell to assume the shape of a nightmare creature. The Shadow Spawn was different, because he had lived in that body for many months. The form of the Onyx Serpent, however, had been constructed purely by observing the great beast and sensing his essence through shadow dance. As a result, Sunny felt that the mastery of the fourth step of his aspect legacy was already within his grasp. All he had to do was contemplate the revelations gained during the battle, absorb the knowledge, and integrate it into the systematic framework of shadow dance he had already established. The evolution was already in sight. He could practically smell it. Still, there was a bit of work left to do before he could reap the rewards. Closing his eyes, Sunny tried to remember the perilous, ferocious battle with the Azure Serpent in all its harrowing details. It was better to do it now, while the memories were still fresh, and the remnants of the serpentine form still lingered in his mind. Time flowed slowly. Chapter 1291, Perilous Gift. Shadow Dance was both the legacy of his aspect and a battle art Sunny had invented. That battle art was insidious, shapeless, and ever-changing. Its purpose was to steal that which made the enemy strong and use it to destroy them. The first step of Shadow Dance was the foundation of this ability. Sunny had mastered it during his bitter battle with Nephis, whom he knew all too well. It allowed him to peer into the very essence of the enemy's battle style and gain an almost supernatural understanding of what they would do, as well as the ability to mimic it. The second step was a continuation of the first. It was the same in all aspects except for scale. Assuming the persona of Mongrel, Sunny had battled countless awakened and absorbed their styles in order to make his ability more ubiquitous. He had mastered it during the final battle of the Dream Tournament, facing Morgan. That breakthrough deepened his understanding of the fundamental, governing principles of battle, which in turn allowed him to shadow unfamiliar and sophisticated battle styles much faster and with greater ease. He also gained the ability to intuitively sense the unique ways in which his opponents utilized their soul essence to make those styles possible. The third step was different. It expanded on the first two, broadening the scope of Shadow Dance by redefining what a battle style was. Outwardly, that simply meant that Sunny had begun including nightmare creatures in the ranks of enemies he shadowed. Inwardly, however, the distinction was much greater. The third step had more to do with Sunny himself than with his enemies. After plunging into the alien and perverse minds of various abominations in the Red Colosseum, he still found himself falling short of an epiphany. That was because Sunny had to let go of his own sense of self to truly be able to shadow things that were innately different from him. He had to become more like the shapeless, formless shadows. He had managed to pass this impossible test because of the battle with Nightmare. The third mastery vastly broadened and improved his ability to shadow his enemies, as well as giving him the ability to perceive the flow of essence within them clearly. However, it also made Shadow Dance a double-edged sword. Sunny had found it easy to get lost in the form of an adversary, forgetting himself forever. The best defense against this risk was his true name, which served as the anchor of his soul. And now there was the fourth step. It is even more dangerous. Sunny still felt the lingering remnants of the azure serpent paint his perception of the world. After delving into the form of the mad beast so deeply, he struggled to shake it off. The fourth step was also a continuation of the previous one, a logical progression that both completed and transformed the perilous gift of the third step. The third step was about breaking the rigid constraints of Sunny's mind to make it as shapeless and adaptable as a shadow. The fourth step was about allowing Sunny's physical form to follow suit. The key to mastering it was shadow manifestation. In the dreadful crucible of Antarctica, Sunny had invented Shadow Shell and Shadow Incarnation, which gave him all the tools he needed to reach the fourth mastery. But it wasn't until the battle with Darren of the Twilight Sea that he hammered all these elements together into a cohesive whole. Thinking about it, he shivered. Any form, any shape, the ability to not only grasp the essence of, but also become any creature he truly came to know. The prospect of such an ability seemed limitless, but so was its danger. What will I become if I use the fourth step a lot? There was an even more frightening question. If the fourth step of Shadow Dance was already so incredible and daunting, then what would the fifth, the sixth, and the seventh steps look like? Sunny felt that he needed to be careful, but he also knew that he was not going to let go of this power. He needed it. With a sigh, he thought back to the battle with Darren of the Twilight Sea and started going over every moment of it, absorbing the feeling of becoming a great serpent into his bones. With every minute that passed, he felt the moment where everything would click together, drawing closer. The waters of the great river were already dimming by the time Sunny opened his eyes. He let out a deep sigh and remained motionless for a few moments, contemplating his progress. I'm so close. It was probably a matter of days, a week or two at most, before he mastered the fourth step of Shadow Dance and received the fourth legacy relic. Excited, Sunny wondered what it would be. A shadow? A memory? Or something else entirely, like another drop of ichor? Whatever it is, I hope Bloodweave doesn't gobble it up again. Suddenly bitter, he glanced at the horizon, and then hurriedly summoned the Crown of Twilight back. Soon, the seven suns rose from the depths and chased away the impenetrable darkness of the night. The dim twilight of dawn enveloped the ketch for a brief period of time. At that moment, Sunny felt a flood of essence rush into his cores. Amazing. The rate of recovery was indeed greatly enhanced. Sunny had 5 shadow cores instead of 1, so it took 5 times as long for him to recover all his essence, without the aid of the Shroud of Dusk. With it and the eye, though, it felt as though he would be able to replenish his reserves fully in the span of a single day. Half at dawn, and another half at dusk. If he was even slightly frugal, he would practically never run out of essence. Feeling encouraged, he glanced at the frail figure of Ananke, then turned to Nephis. Sunny silently pointed to the serpentine band of black metal on his head. It was time to ask more questions. Chapter 1292, History of Time. Nephis nodded, indicating that she had read the description of the Crown of Twilight. The two of them could have communicated through the Blasi to discuss how they would approach the conversation with Ananke, but really there was no need. The old woman showed no indication of being someone they needed to be wary of, so they could simply ask. There was one question that had to be answered above all else, though. Sunny shifted slightly, then called, "Grandmother." Ananke stirred, as if waking up from a dream, and looked at them with her cloudy eye. "Yes, my lord." Still uncomfortable with this form of address, Sunny thought for a moment and asked, "Have you ever heard about that which was defiled?" The old woman suddenly froze. Her hand, which was resting on the steering oar, trembled. For a while, nothing but the sound of water splashing against the hull of the ketch could be heard. It seemed that she wasn't happy to hear that question. However, Sunny and Nephis had no choice but to ask it. They needed to learn everything they could about the assumed goal of this nightmare. Eventually, Ananke sighed. "That which was defiled. I guess you are talking about the defilement, my lord." Sunny's eyes glinted. "The defilement?" Remembering the horrors of the Southern Campaign, he made a sudden connection. There were 3 nightmare creatures he had slain that bore a similar name: the Defiled Witness, the Defiled Herald, and the Defiled Seeker of Truth. The first one was the fallen devil who led the pack of eyeless beasts. The second was the corrupted devil who led the group of desiccated corpses, their mouths sewn shut. Sunny had received the stifled scream after that battle. The third one was the fallen titan he had killed by chance during the joint battle against the enormous horde of abominations in East Antarctica, receiving the Mirror of Truth. Had all of them come from the tomb of Ariel? The old woman nodded. Yes, the defilement. I am sorry, my lord and lady. I should have known that you would not be aware of these matters. You are outsiders, after all. Sunny and Nephis glanced at each other, wondering what she meant. Ananke remained silent for a few moments, then spoke solemnly. To understand what the defilement is, you will first need to learn a little about the history of the Great River. I will try to explain as well as I can. Nephis frowned slightly. The history? I am not sure I understand what history a river that flows through time can possess. The old woman smiled faintly. Time within the tomb of Ariel is unpredictable and convoluted. Sometimes it flows slowly, while sometimes it flows swiftly. Sometimes time rises in great storms, or grows stale, or circles forever as a whirlpool. Currents merge and separate, or disappear without a trace. But nevertheless, for most of us, unless we enter turbulent waters, time always moves, just like in the outside world. It is just that our own time is different from the time there. Noticing a hint of confusion on their faces, Ananke looked thoughtful for a while. Then she sighed. The best way I can explain it is like this. The great river does indeed flow from the future into the past, but that is only in relation to the outside world. Here, this kind of time is no different from space. However, the river still has a past, a present, and a future in relation to itself. Here, this kind of time is just like the time of the outside. Nephis tilted her head a little. So, one can say that Sunny and I entered the tomb of Ariel in a distant future, meaning much higher upstream. But one can also say that we entered a month ago. Both distance and days are a measure of time. The old woman nodded. Indeed, you are wise, my lady. The corner of Sunny's mouth twitched. That's the second time she calls Nephis wise. 0 times for me, though. Still, he understood the idea. There were actually 2 concepts named time inside the tomb of Ariel. One was the flow of the great river itself, which was prone to all kinds of shenanigans, while the second was no different from the concept of time they were familiar with. The old woman continued. So, the great river has a history as well, or rather, it is us, the river people, who have it. That history started a long time ago, when the Sibyls first entered the tomb of Ariel with their people. There were others too, all kinds of humans and creatures who came seeking truth, which is said to be hidden at the estuary. Her creaky voice grew wistful. That was when we, heralds of the nightmare spell, came to the great river as well. I was told that it was a golden age. The Sibyls established their cities, and powerful seekers built solitary manors among the waves. They had escaped the end, and lived in peace and prosperity within the tomb of Ariel. Sunny found something curious and asked, "You were told? You weren't there yourself?" Come to think of it, when Ananke had spoken about the persecution of the followers of Weaver, she had mentioned not experiencing it personally. That statement had sounded rather strange at the time, but there were many other questions that needed to be asked first. The old woman chuckled. Goodness, of course no. I might look old, but I am not that ancient. No, I was born much later, after Weave was already established. Unlike those who have come from outside, like you, I am riverborn. Sunny made a mental note that there was a distinction between the outsiders and the riverborn, and continued to listen. Ananke took a hoarse breath, then said somberly, "But that golden age, eventually it came to an end. First, the voices of the gods grew silent, causing the Sibyls to turn their gazes to the estuary, and then the defilement was born." Chapter 1293, Defilement. Ananke's weathered, wrinkly face grew dark. The old woman lingered for a while before saying, "The other name for the defilement is corruption, a special kind of corruption that appeared on the great river and then spread from downstream like a plague, or rather, was spread." Nephis leaned forward a little. "Spread from downstream?" The old woman nodded heavily. "Yes. It is because the defilement, its origin, is the estuary." Her cloudy eyes grew distant. The Seekers were always trying to reach the estuary, traveling further and further downstream, but none of them succeeded in finding it. Eventually, they built a city of their own in the far reaches of the past, a city called Verge. Its grandeur could compete with the bustling prosperity of the large cities ruled by the Sibyls, and from there they continued their search, until, eventually, one of them really managed to enter the estuary. The old woman gripped the steering oar as she looked at the vast expanse of the great river, then continued dully. However, what he found there was not the truth, but corruption. Or perhaps it was the truth that he found that corrupted him. That seeker became the first of the defiled, and he brought the defilement back with him to the verge. The city of seekers was consumed by the defilement, and those consumed by it became twisted and monstrous. They spread from there like a plague, bringing a great calamity to the river people. Ananke grew silent, breathing heavily. Sunny was scowling deeply. So that was what happened. The hideous truth that the demon of dread had hidden in the heart of the Black Pyramid. The first person who learned it was consumed by corruption as a result. Not only that, but he also infected the rest of the seekers with it, destroying, or rather transforming, an entire city into a nightmarish source of the spreading corruption, of the defilement. Just what kind of secret had Ariel buried at the dawn of time? More importantly, was that what Darren of the Twilight Sea had tried to achieve? Storm the corrupted city of Verge and slay the first witness to the harrowing truth, who was the root of the defilement. If so, their task would be a dreadful one. Nephis seemed to be thinking the same. After pondering for a while, she asked, "What happened next?" Ananke shifted on her bench, then sighed. Because of the defilement, the peaceful waters of the great river became plagued by the corrupted. The most powerful of them come from the furthest reaches of the past, downstream, as well as from the terrible emptiness of the future, where you have come from, my lord and lady. The river people found themselves trapped between the harrowing past and the doomed future, with nowhere to escape. Of course, they fought against the defilement and resisted for a while. She looked away and said bitterly, "But they also fought among themselves. That was how we were chased away and forced to escape upstream, braving terrible dangers. Eventually, we lost all contact with those who had exiled us. The last we heard was that many of the Sibyls had succumbed to the defilement, and that many of their cities had fallen. Even Twilight, the city of the Serpent King, had been lost. Now, it is the dusk of the river people. Soon, there won't be any of us left at all." Sunny felt that he understood what had happened with the people who escaped the end of the world by entering the tomb of Ariel. Most of them had either died or been corrupted, and the rest would soon follow. That was the fate of the Great River civilization. So, there were two ways to resolve the conflict of the nightmare. They had to either help the destruction of that civilization, or turn the tide by eliminating the source of the spreading defilement. The latter, of course, would receive much higher praise from the spell, since it would differ drastically from fate. He also noted the mention of Twilight, which, as it turned out, was the name of the city King Darren and his vassals had built. Another interesting point was that Fallen Grace, the city ruled by the last Sibyl, was situated in the region of the Great River that had already mostly succumbed to the defilement. Perhaps it was the last human stronghold remaining in the tomb of Ariel. And another thing, Ananke had said that there were two places inside the tomb of Ariel that were much more dreadful and dangerous than all the rest: the far reaches of the future upstream and the far reaches of the past downstream. His luck was incredible, as always. Not only had Sunny entered the Great River in one of these harrowing places, but he also seemed destined to journey into the other. Great. Simply great. What Sunny paid most attention to, however, was a simple question. Just how was the defilement spreading? He did not know a lot about corruption, but it didn't seem like something that could just happen. Even Skinwalker could not infect humans with corruption. Instead, it could only infect them with itself. Did the defilement have a similar nature? He did not think that it did. If all the nightmare creatures in the tomb of Ariel were vessels of the same entity, the first seeker, they wouldn't be fighting each other. That was an important distinction. Looking at Ananke, he asked in a dark tone, "Grandmother, do you know how the defilement spreads?" The old woman shook her head. "I am sorry, my lord. I do not. In truth, I've only met a true defiled once. Weave is situated too far upstream, so while we had to battle corrupted creatures of the future often, no one from the Verge has ever reached us." Nephis frowned. "Except for that one defiled?" Ananken nodded. "Yes." The water was sparkling under the sunlight, and the ketch was flying across the waves, traveling further and further into the past. Nephis hesitated for a moment, and then asked, "What happened when the defiled appeared?" The old woman did not answer for a while. Eventually she raised her head and smiled bitterly. "The day he appeared was the day Weave was destroyed." Her words traveled somberly across the surface of the water, soon disappearing into the wind. Chapter 1294, Corruption. In the morning, they enjoyed delicious food and fragrant wine from Ananke's wooden box. The old woman herself seemed a little bit more energetic today, but the long conversation had tired her out. She ate very little and returned to the steering oar, looking at the flowing water with a distant expression. She must have been thinking about her city, Weave, which had been destroyed by the defiled. Without having to discuss it, Sunny and Nephis decided to give their kind guide some privacy. They had to digest the many revelations of the past day anyway. Sunny was leaning his back on the side of the ketch, cradling a steaming cup of tea in his hands. Nephis was by his side, looking at the sky. After some time had passed in comfortable silence, he used the blessing of dusk to ask. She shifted slightly and turned to look at him. Sunny was suddenly painfully aware of how close they were. His pale face was reflecting in the calm depths of her striking gray eyes. He sighed. Weave was destroyed, and yet she is taking us there. Why? Nephis contemplated for a few moments. Ananke survived the destruction, so more people could have survived as well. If not, it would be to scavenge for supplies for the journey ahead. We will see when we get there. Sunny took a sip from his cup, enjoying the warmth of the freshly brewed tea. The ketch was swaying gently, and the view was heavenly. It was really hard to believe that they were inside a nightmare. What do you think about what we've learned so far? Neff's face darkened a little. She looked away and shrugged. The situation is better than I thought. It seems we have a clear enemy, at least. More than that, not all of the Great River is as dangerous as our starting point. I was wary, a little bit, thinking that every nightmare creature here is like the azure serpent, the black turtle, and that horrid butterfly. But it doesn't seem that way. She paused, then added somberly, however, I am concerned about the others. We all came from the same moment in time, so they should have been sent to the same region of the Great River. Why is there no sign of them? Sunny looked down with a grim expression. He shared that concern. Cassie, Effie, Kai, Jet, and even Mordred, where were they? None of them were easy to kill. He firmly believed that his friends were still alive, somewhere out there. Or at least, he wanted to. But it is strange, isn't it? Nephis glanced at him with a silent question. He frowned. The way we entered the nightmare. As masters, we get to keep our own bodies, true, but we are still supposed to replace someone from that region and era. Whose place have you and I taken? From what Ananke told us, there were not supposed to be any humans further than Weave. It doesn't make sense. Nephis seemed taken aback a little. Of course, her reserved expression had not changed even a little bit. However, Sunny knew her well enough to see that she was stumped. You're right. It is strange. He remained silent for a few moments, thinking. Could it be that the spell had failed to find suitable hosts for the other members of the cohort that far upstream, and so sent them someplace else? Eventually, he shook his head and asked, regardless, that defilement, how exactly does it spread? There has not been a single instance of a human from the waking world succumbing to corruption, as far as I know. What really happened to that seeker in the estuary? Nephis did not answer, looking at the sky. After a while, she shook her head. Countless humans from our world have become corrupted. Every sleeper that fails the first nightmare turns into a nightmare creature. Isn't it the same thing? Sunny tilted his head, stunned by that simple comparison. Nephis was right. Numerous people had turned into nightmare creatures in the waking world already. It was just that none of them had been of a higher rank than dormant, because the trials of the spell killed them long before they could set foot on the path of ascension. While she was thinking, Nephis suddenly added in a contemplative tone, Seeker who learned the truth of the estuary and brought corruption to the Great River. Actually, it reminds me of something you told me once. Sunny raised an eyebrow. Huh? She nodded. It was a long time ago, on the Forgotten Shore, when we were enthralled by the soul-devouring tree. You told me about the lineage memory you had found in its branches. In its description, wasn't it said that the loathsome thieving bird had gone mad after seeing a glimpse of unknown frozen in the depths of Weaver's eye? He shivered, suddenly consumed by an ominous premonition. Why? Nephis shrugged. The eyeglass manaim da niligum pesta, pinda taida, hinunais competur taidam ones considering that it managed to steal a daemon's eye. Still, its mind was destroyed by one glimpse at what was hidden in Weaver's pupil. The seeker saw something that he shouldn't have, and became corrupted. Maybe he brought the forbidden knowledge back with him. Maybe that is how the defilement spreads, people learning the truth of the estuary. Sunny grew quiet, thinking about what she said. The description of the drop of ichor indeed stated that the vile thieving bird had gone mad after seeing the reflection of the unknown in Weaver's eye. Was it perhaps another way of saying that it had become corrupted? And if so, had something similar happened to the first seeker? Was the truth buried by Ariel in the heart of the Black Pyramid the same truth Weaver had witnessed once, and which became forever frozen in the depths of his, or her, eyes? You wanted to be free of the truth, so you didn't deserve it. He remained silent for a while, then sighed. Well, that's great. Now, we don't only have to be wary of nightmare creatures, we even have to be careful about what we learn. Damnation, you do know that I am a very curious guy, don't you, Neff? She looked at him, lingered for a bit, and smiled. Oh, I do. You are indeed a very curious guy, lost from light, who was born from the shadows, rightful heir of... Sonny opened his eyes wide and hurriedly dismissed the mental connection of the blessy. Hey, hey! Nephis leaned on the side of the ketch and laughed softly. What? He opened his mouth, then closed it again, and gritted his teeth. Can you maybe forget that? Forever? Nephis looked away with white sparks dancing in her eyes. Can I? Well, I don't know. I have a very good memory. Sonny stared at her for a while, then scoffed. Admit it, though. You thought it was a bit cool, didn't you? I bet you did. Like you thought Mongrel was. Neff's face suddenly grew still. I absolutely did not. He grinned. Sure. Ah, but I have a good memory too. What was it that you said in that nightclub in NQSC? If I recall correctly. Nephis closed her eyes and yawned. Ah, I am so tired. I think I need to rest now. Sonny laughed. Really? All right then. Rest well. Chapter 1295. No One Knows. While Nephis was pretending to sleep, Sonny moved to the stern of the ketch and looked at Ananke, who seemed to have paid no attention to their conversation. Sensing his attention, however, she turned slightly and asked, Yes, my lord? He hesitated for a few moments. I wanted to ask you about Weaver. The old woman smiled slightly, as if uplifted by his question. What would you like to know? Sonny remained silent for a moment. What didn't he want to know? Demons were surrounded by mystery, and while he slowly accumulated a lot of knowledge about them, much more knowledge than an average human in the ancient times of the Dream Realm had, most likely there were still wide gaps in it. The problem was that Ananke was not really a person from the Dream Realm. She had been born in the tomb of Ariel and spent her life in isolation from the outside world. Still, she was a priestess of the nightmare spell. She had to know many things, even if some of that knowledge had undoubtedly been twisted as a result of becoming religious doctrine. So, he was unsure how much he would be able to learn from the old woman. Sonny scratched the back of his head. Well, for starters, was Weaver a man or a woman? He was really tired of stumbling over his words every time he tried to say something about them. Ananke chuckled. No one knows. Weaver was a master of lies, after all, so you should take anything that is known about the demon of fate with a grain of salt. Weaver was the firstborn of the unknown. His or her domain was fate, and just like fate, Weaver was fickle, inevitable, and terrifying. Despite not possessing dreadful battle power, unlike some other demons, the demon of fate was feared the most. Sonny was not surprised. He couldn't imagine a more frightening enemy than someone whose weapon was fate itself. That said, he wasn't sure whether Weaver had been able to control fate or simply perceive it. The latter seemed more probable, even if everyone had been convinced otherwise. Was that one of Weaver's lies? He inhaled deeply. Who was the unknown then? The old woman smiled. I don't know. Sonny blinked a couple of times. Well, that is not surprising. There is a reason why that being is called the unknown. After all, actually no. Unknown is just the substitute word the spell uses for the runes it refuses to translate. So, the progenitor of the demons is called something else. The priesthood of the nightmare spell probably started calling that being unknown for the same reason I did, considering that they are the carriers of the spell as well. Or rather, of an ancient, rudimentary version of the spell. He shook his head dejectedly. For someone who has chosen to dedicate their lives to serving Weaver, suffering all kinds of mistreatment and persecution, you and your people don't seem to know a lot about the being you serve. Sonny was afraid that Ananke would be offended by his remark, but she simply shook her head. We might not know a lot, but we know all we need. We know that when the gods and the demons started their cursed war, Weaver was the only one who refused to participate. Her weathered face turned somber, and when the flames of that war spread, bringing doom and destruction to all, Weaver was the only one who offered us all a path to salvation. Sonny glanced at Nephis, who could certainly hear what they were talking about. Wondering what she thought about all that, he asked, "That path to salvation is the nightmare spell?" Ananke nodded. Indeed. The nightmare spell was created by Weaver and entrusted to us in order to save us all from the doom that demons brought upon. And there it was. A proclamation of a hidden truth that Sunny had tentatively considered before, but was never really sure of, that the purpose of the spell was not cruel and sinister in nature, but instead fundamentally benevolent, albeit still cruel. However, if that was what Weaver had told people like Ananke, could that truth really be trusted? She had just described the demon of fate as a master of lies, after all, and said that everything about Weaver should be taken with a grain of salt. Nevertheless, Ananke seemed to believe in the benevolence of the nightmare spell wholeheartedly. That was rather strange. How should I put it? The old woman, despite her age and wisdom, seemed a little bit naive. Sunny and Nephis were not the worst people from the waking world by far, but even they had briefly contemplated attacking and killing her after discovering the catch. Yet she had never been on guard against them, instead treating them with utmost sincerity. Her unwavering trust in Weaver was just the same. He hesitated for a long time before speaking again. "Grandmother, I don't mean to offend you, but hasn't that doom come already? Where is the salvation you were promised?" Holding the steering oar, Ananke smiled softly. "Why, it is right here, my lord. It is you, the children of Weaver." Sunny stared at her for a few moments, his expression incredulous. The old woman chuckled. "You might have misunderstood me a little. When I spoke of salvation, I did not mean that my elders, who had accepted the mission of caring for the nightmare spell from Weaver, hoped to save themselves. The Doom War. It threatened to destroy all life, all humans, and all beings, everywhere, forever. So, what they really wanted to save was the future." She paused for a few moments, took a shaky breath, and added, "It might be strange to say this while sailing into the past, but the future, it is still ahead, and so, it can still be saved." Sunny pursed his lips. The dream realm was already a dead world, with only nightmare creatures populating its hellish expanse, and now, the spell had even infected Earth with the same plague that had destroyed it, forcibly pulling more humans there, in an attempt to do what? He sighed. "How exactly are we supposed to save the future? We can't even save ourselves." The old woman shook her head. "That is for you to know, my lord. Although I am a caretaker of the nightmare spell, I am not a person it was meant for. All I can do is help those chosen, like you, brave the thorny path, as much as I can, with what little power I have." She smiled. "Even if it's just for a short while, that is enough for me." Sunny remained motionless for a few moments, then rubbed his face. "Well, isn't that convenient?" Chapter 1296, Doom War. Sunny was not sure that he was buying what Ananke believed, but at the same time, he couldn't completely discard it. Damn Weaver. Just why did the creator of the spell have to be a nebulous and elusive creature, not only surrounded in mystery, but also obsessed with lies? Could there be anyone more untrustworthy? Even though Sunny had inherited Weaver's forbidden lineage, wore Weaver's mask, and had a high affinity to fate, which was Weaver's domain, he still knew close to nothing about the demon of fate. Where had Weaver come from? Who hid behind the fearsome black mask? What motives had guided them? What goals had they pursued? He shook his head with resignation and looked at Ananke, frowning. "Whatever. If I can't learn about Weaver, I should at least learn everything else." Sunny collected his thoughts before asking the next question. "Grandmother, you said that the purpose of the nightmare spell is to save the future from the doom of the great war between the demons and the gods. To be honest, I am not entirely sure what that really means. What exactly is that doom? What made the war so terrible?" The old woman gazed at the flowing expanse of the great river, lingered for a moment, and sighed. "It was indeed terrible. Of course, I have not experienced the horror of those days myself. What I do know was passed down to me from my elders, who had, granted, they escaped the war before the end came, so even they didn't know how and why the true devastation happened." She paused to catch her breath, then continued in her creaky voice. "No one really knows what resentment pushed the demons to rise against the gods. It happened soon after the demon of desire escaped her chains. The youngest among them, the demon of destiny, called upon his siblings to wage war against the heavens. 5 answered his call, and only the demon of fate refused." Ananke moved the steering oar a little, her frail hand as dark as the polished wood. "Many blamed the demons for everything terrible that happened, but, truly, things weren't going well long before their rebellion. Most of the gods had grown distant, and people quarreled with each other, forgetting the days when everything stood together against the corruption. Humans fought against humans, and against other noble creatures. Followers of war burned the temples of shadow, and their empire spread, consuming many weaker realms. Her cloudy eyes were distant, as if the old woman was imagining the wide world that she had never seen or known. She slowly shook her head. So, maybe, the Great War was merely the result, and not the cause of the end. In any case, the 6 demons assembled vast armies and led them against the gods. What was different about that war was that they were not immediately defeated. After all, there were many lesser deities, but none of them were as feared as the demons, let alone if 6 of them united. Others joined their cause, and even the great gods couldn't defeat such an enemy with ease. The old woman trembled. The war was furious and merciless. Many realms had become battlefields and were devoured by flames. But the worst was still to come, because instead of coming to a conclusion, the war only continued to grow fiercer. Those loyal to the gods took up arms, and in response, the demons recruited more allies, mortal champions who had suffered the tyranny of the empire, ancient creatures that had been banished into the darkest corners of the underworld, and everyone else who bore deep grudges against the divine. Even the harrowing Nephilim. Utter madness was unleashed, and soon there was no place untouched by the war. Everywhere turned into the battlefield. Ananke glanced at the flowing waters of the great river and remained silent for a while. Eventually she said, "Nowhere was safe. The forests burned, the fields turned to deserts, the rivers dried up. A passing blow from the fighting deities could destroy entire cities. Over time, countless humans were displaced or lost their lives. That was when we started calling it the Doom War, believing that it would become the end of everything. It was also when Weaver created the nightmare spell and gifted it to us mortals." Sunny suddenly remembered the forgotten shore and the ruin that had befallen that land when the shining figure fell from the sky. Was that radiant creature one of the soldiers in the dreadful war between the 6 demons and the 6 gods? Was it perhaps one of the Nephilim? Or an actual angel? If what had happened on the Forgotten Shore was happening all across the dream realm, then it was no surprise that the ancient humans there saw it as the end of the world. Ananke sighed. Weaver offered us a path to salvation, but back then, the demon of fate was despised by all, the followers of the gods, the followers of the demons, and even those who did not want anything to do with the war. We, the priests of the nightmare spell, were despised as well. Few listened to us. Still, some did. The nightmare spell was alluring after all, even in its infant state. Sunny tilted his head. Alluring? The old woman nodded. Of course, it gave its carriers so many abilities. The ability to possess memories and echoes, the ability to instantly be able to enter your soul sea, awaken your aspect, be guided on the path of ascension. The nightmare spell promised people who desperately wished for power means to defend themselves. So, Weaver was not only the most insidious demon, but also a devious salesman. The nightmare spell was packed with all kinds of boons that desperate people would find irresistible, boons that the humans of the waking world took for granted, since they had nothing to compare them to. No wonder the spell spread like a plague, despite the contemptible reputation of its creator. So, what happened then? Ananke lingered for a moment. The priests of the nightmare spell helped it spread, trying their best to bestow its gifts on new carriers. That was when my elders entered the tomb of Ariel. We never learned what happened after we left. The war must have turned even more harrowing, somehow, and neither side emerged victorious. Instead, everyone was destroyed. Even the gods perished. She hesitated. I heard that more outsiders appeared after the voices of the gods grew silent. Maybe they brought news to the tomb of Ariel. But by then, we were already chased far upstream, so we never met them. The old woman's voice grew wistful as she said, "By now, most of them must have been consumed by the defilement. My lord, perhaps you can learn more if you speak to Dusk of Fallen Grace. She is one of the Sibyls after all. She must know more than a humble exile like me does." Chapter 1297, Where Nightmares Come From. Sunny remained silent for a while, thinking. There was a lot to think about. Although Neff's eyes were closed, he could tell that she was thoughtful as well. The history of the dream realm, which they could only guess before, was revealed in front of them with stark clarity. Of course, Ananke had not witnessed all these events herself, but the tales she relayed were passed down to her from people who actually had. No wonder Mordred had told him that the knowledge and experience awakened brought back from their nightmares were perhaps more important than the power and abilities they gained. and that legacy clans, especially those ruled by the sovereigns, were very particular about which seeds their scions challenged. Both valor and song must have accumulated a great deal of knowledge. However, that knowledge was not something just anyone could access. Even Nephis, who had been adopted into the great clan, did not seem privy to most of their secrets yet. That was only natural. After all, knowledge was the origin of power, according to Weaver, and Anvil would not trust her with power until she had proven herself. He lingered for a few moments, then looked to his right, where Ananke's mask still lay on the wooden deck. Stretching his hand, he picked it up and stared at the fearsome, demonic face. Sunny could not glimpse anything about the mask. He did not even know whether it was a memory or a simple piece of carved wood. Glancing at Ananke, he pointed to the mask and asked, "Is this a divine memory?" She remained silent for a few moments, then slowly shook her head. "No, my lord. This one is merely sacred, a lesser facsimile of the true mask of Weaver. It is a part of the ceremonial garb that we, priests and priestesses of the nightmare spell, wear, both to escape the gaze of our pursuers and to follow in the footsteps of our benefactor, the demon of fate. The more accomplished a priest was, the higher rank memory they would be bestowed." Ananke looked away with a faint smile. "My mother, whom I inherited this memory from, was one of the few who received a mask of the sacred rank, which was the highest of honors. As for divine memories of the Mask of Weaver, I've never seen these holy relics. There were only ever 2 of them, entrusted personally to the first 2 who were chosen by the demon of fate, the high priest and the high priestess of the nightmare spell." Sunny studied the surface of the mask some more. After a short stretch of silence, he followed his whim and asked, "Does it have the enchantment?" He was curious if Ananke, as the priestess of the spell, could teach him how to gaze at the tapestry of fate without dying. The old woman looked at him with a surprised expression. "Where is my eye? No, it doesn't. But, if I may be so bold as to ask, how do you know the name of that enchantment, my lord? This sacred memory of mine only possesses 2. It was only the 2 holy masks that possessed a 3rd, and even then, very few ever learned about it." Sunny hesitated for a long time, then sighed and summoned Weaver's mask. Soon, a fearsome mask of polished black wood appeared in his left hand, identical to the one he was holding in his right. Ananke's eyes widened slightly. "My lord, is that?" He nodded. "Yes. Before you start assuming things, I am not a priest of the nightmare spell, nor am I a chosen of the demon of fate. It's just that I found this thing a few years ago in a god-forsaken pit of a cursed city. I've been stumbling on various traces of Weaver while traveling the dream realm, so I guess I am curious about him, or her, or whatever Weaver was." Sunny considered telling her about Bloodweave and the phalanx of the daemon in question, which he had swallowed in the Ebony Tower, but decided against it. He didn't want to give the old woman a heart attack, or put strange thoughts in her head. Her reverent attitude was already rather uncomfortable. Ananke remained silent for a few moments, looking at the mask and Sunny with that same reverence. Then she sighed softly. "My lord, was this memory helpful to you on your journey?" He raised an eyebrow. "Helpful? Well, I guess it was. It saved my life a few times. But it also almost killed me a few times. In any case, I probably wouldn't be standing here without it." The old woman smiled. "Then it was fate that guided you to it, and me to you, by Weaver's grace." Sunny looked at her somberly. He didn't like being reminded of just how helpless he was against fate. Neither did he like the idea of being a marionette for a long-dead daemon. But he couldn't really dispute what Ananke had said. First, because it was pointless to argue faith with logic. Second, because he wasn't sure that his logic was sound. Who was to say that the damned demon of fate had not really arranged for various things to happen in the distant future? "This is distressing." He let out a heavy sigh, then dismissed his weaver's mask and put the other one on the bench near Ananke. "You shouldn't leave it lying on the deck. It is a gift from your mother, after all." The old woman gently took the wooden mask and placed it on her lap. "Thank you, my lord. You are wise." Sunny furtively glanced at her and hid a smile. I got one too." Then he looked at the beautiful vista of the great river and said, "So, when your elders entered the tomb of Ariel, most of the priesthood of the nightmare spell remained outside, splintered in order to convert more carriers during the Doom War?" Ananke simply nodded. Yes. She seemed down, so Sunny suddenly wanted to encourage her. He thought for a few moments and then shrugged. "Well, they've done a great job. The nightmare spell outlived both the demons and the gods. In the future, it is nearly all-powerful. Ah, by the way, you said that it was very alluring to people even at the start. But what about the price? Weren't they afraid of dying in the nightmares? The old woman looked at him with a hint of confusion. Nightmares, my lord? What do you mean? Why would people be afraid of dying in their dreams? At that moment, Nephis opened her eyes and turned her head, looking at Ananke silently. Sunny turned too, his gaze becoming sharp. Does she not know what a nightmare is? He lingered for a moment, then asked, did the spell not put people through trials way back then? Ananke touched her white hair, then shook her head. Trials? No, I've never heard of anything like that. Sunny blinked a couple of times. Now, that's new. Why would nightmares only exist in our time? That doesn't make any sense. Nephis seemed to share his thoughts. She remained silent for a moment, then suddenly leaned forward and asked, Grandmother, I have a question then. Where exactly does the nightmare in the nightmare spell come from? Sunny blinked. What a strange question. The old woman stared at them in bewilderment. After a while, she said, that is what Weaver named it. The demon of fate must have had a reason, but it is not for us to know what that reason was. The nightmare spell. It is just what it has always been called. Sunny and Nephis glanced at each other. The spell was always very particular with its words, and Weaver must have been the same. There was no way that the grand creation of the nebulous daemon had been named without much thought. But what was the meaning of that name? Neither of them knew, and Ananke didn't seem to know either. Damn Weaver. Chapter 1298 Noble Cause. Sunny left the old woman alone, and returned to where Nephis was resting, full of thought. He had not received all the answers he wanted from Ananke, but at the same time he learned a lot, maybe even too much. I don't know. There was too much information, all of it fragmented, ambiguous, and confusing. Not only that, but he was not even sure that it could be trusted. In any case, many mysteries he had never hoped to solve were resolved now. Like the destruction of the Forgotten Shore, it had become collateral damage in the war between the demons and the gods. Or the identity of the nameless prisoner of the ruined cathedral. It was one of the first 2 apostles chosen by Weaver to tend to and spread the nightmare spell, whoever these apostles had been. Sunny even had more context for why the followers of War God had been destroying the temples of Shadow God in his first nightmare, and what Empire Oro of the Nine was a soldier of. Still, he had even more questions now. Like always, my head hurts. He was saying these words a lot in this nightmare. Sunny sighed, then looked at Nephis. What do you think? With how obsessed she was with destroying the spell, the revelations about its origin and presumed purpose had to have shaken her, and maybe even her conviction. But Nephis simply shrugged. Makes sense. He raised an eyebrow. Huh? She looked at him and remained silent for a moment. That the nightmare spell has a purpose, and that its purpose is tied somehow to the destruction of the dream realm. However, that doesn't change anything. Sunny leaned back and studied her calm face. She seemed as composed as ever. So, knowing that doesn't change anything for you? Nephis looked at the sky. Why would it? It is still hateful. It is still the cause of indescribable misery, that of countless people, and my own. Salvation? Future? To me, it sounds like the spell was designed to destroy countless futures for the sake of a future that Weaver envisioned, and fuel it with the lives of those like us who have never asked to be a part of Weaver's schemes. Sunny frowned, then glanced at the frail figure of Ananke. Luckily, it didn't seem like she had heard them. Nephis gritted her teeth. If a burglar comes into your home, kills your family, and takes everything you have from you, does it really matter if the burglar intends to use the spoils for a noble cause? Would you hate him less? Sunny sighed. He could see her point too. I guess it depends. Nephis looked at him darkly. Depends? On what? He lingered for a few moments, collecting his thoughts. On the nature of the relationship between the dream realm and our world. How separate are they, exactly? Would corruption have spread to the waking world eventually, even without the spell, or not? Things like that. Sorry, I seem to have lost track of the metaphor. She stared at him for a while, then turned away with a scowl. Sunny winced. His argument was reasonable, but humans weren't. That included him as well. If someone murdered Rain to save an entire neighborhood, he would have hated them all the same. He did not say anything else, looking somberly at the great river. Eventually, it was Nephis who broke the silence. Her voice was even. I am curious about something else, though. Sunny glanced at her and raised an eyebrow. What? She frowned slightly. What happened after Ananke's elders entered the tomb of Ariel and lost contact with the outside world? How did the war escalate even further? What could have happened to cause both sides to be destroyed? Neph's eyes glinted with white radiance. And what role did the spell play in the conclusion of the war? How has it grown to its current state? Sunny felt a sudden chill as he remembered the description of bone weave. Oh, why have Weaver disappeared? No one knew where Weaver went and what they did until it was too late. With white light burning in her eyes, Nephis looked at him and asked, "Did you ever think that, maybe, the nightmare spell is not only responsible for the devastation of our world, but also for the destruction of the dream realm?" He remained silent for a while, his expression troubled. Then, Sunny rolled his eyes. "Damn it, Neph, you do remember what flaw I have, right? Please don't subject me to avalanches of questions like that. To answer all of them, I don't know, I have no idea, I have no clue, there's no way to tell." Nephis blinked a couple of times, then opened her eyes wide and covered her mouth with a hand. "Oh, sorry," Sunny continued nonchalantly. "That is a mystery to me, who knows? And yes, I did consider it before. There, all done." In the awkward silence that followed, he smiled and said, "Anyway, all this talking made me hungry. Let's eat." Sunny felt spoiled eating Ananke's home-cooked food, so much so that the weight he had lost on the dark island was slowly returning. The old woman herself still ate like a bird, but she seemed to be in a better state than before. Her hands were shaking less, and she remained lucid for longer periods of time before having to rest. The ketch continued to move downstream, devouring distance with great speed. Nothing had attacked them yet, perhaps because they had left the most dangerous region of the great river, perhaps because Ananke knew how to navigate the flowing waters to avoid danger. It was probably both. The day came to an end, followed by a peaceful night. Sunny spent most of that time quietly working on mastering the fourth step of shadow dance. The dire enlightenment he had gained in the battle against the Azure Serpent was steadily leading him to success. In the morning, they enjoyed a scrumptious breakfast, and then, nothing changed. The journey continued, and the waters of the great river remained the same. The old ketch continued to travel into the past. Chapter 1299, Nameless Things. A few more days passed in blissful idleness. Sunny continued concentrating on shadow dance, not ready yet to learn more from Ananke. The information she had shared with them was already vexing enough, and he was struggling to parse through all of its many implications. He also resumed his habit of studying the weave of the estuary key, even though it still remained a complete mystery to him. After hesitating for a while, Sunny turned to the old woman for help, but there was no result. Although she was a priestess of the nightmare spell and a follower of the demon of fate, she was not a weaver herself. Sunny knew more about weaver sorcery than Ananke did, which was not to say that she did not know anything about sorcery at all. After spending several days in the ketch, Sunny and Nephis noticed two strange things about the swift vessel and its owner. The first one concerned the ketch itself. Its sails were always full of wind, pushing the boat across the shining surface of the great river with enviable speed, which was not too strange in and of itself, if not for the fact that this speed was too constant and stable. It also did not seem as though the direction and strength of the wind ever changed, or rather, they never changed around the ketch. They did, however, change some distance away from it, creating an eerie situation where the waters where the wooden sailboat passed were different from the rest of the world. Not only that, but Ananke also never manipulated the sails in any way to help them catch the wind, and nothing ever attacked them. Both Sunny and Nephis knew, of course, that the ketch was not a mundane boat. It was obviously enchanted in some way, they just did not know how. There were no runes carved into its surface and no sophisticated runic patterns like on the Chainbreaker. There was no spellweave hidden within the old wood, either. Eventually, they were defeated by curiosity and asked Ananke directly. That was how Sunny learned that, while the old woman was not a weaver, she was still a sorceress. However, the sorcery she used did not belong to the demon of fate, nor was it the runic sorcery created by Hope. Instead, it was the ancient sorcery upon which Hope's runic magic was based, the sorcery of names. Noticing their bewilderment, the old woman chuckled. "My lord and lady, don't look too surprised. I am not some kind of powerful shaper. I was just taught a few simple names and phrases by my mother, enough to sail the great river and provide for myself." Sunny and Nephis were still stunned. It was not every day that they met a practitioner of an entirely new system of sorcery. In fact, Sunny had only ever met two sorcerers, himself and Noctis. Noctis had known a great deal about true names of things and how to invoke them, but his was a more sophisticated kind of magic, which relied on inscribing the names with runes instead of speaking them directly. Nephis had met a few more, considering that she was acquainted with the Forge Masters of Clan Valor. She had told him that the members of the Valor family often received aspects tied to crafting, which was how they were able to create powerful memories. However, the family had accumulated plenty of knowledge of runic sorcery as well. The cage that Sunny and Cassie had almost died in during their imprisonment in the Night Temple was proof. Ananke tilted her head curiously. Are there no shapers in the future? Well, makes sense. We were a dying breed even before the war, and with the gifts of the nightmare spell, no one would need to seek power in such an antiquated and obsolete art. She lingered for a few moments, and then pointed to the sails. It is rather simple, really. I just invoked the name of the wind, the name of moving forward across water, and the name of the sail, then put them together into a verse. I also used the name of concealment and the name of being hidden from predators. Of course, most of that was only possible because this old catch of mine is imbued with a true name of its own, which served as an anchor for the entire verse. Ananke sighed. It is also most of my repertoire. True names were never meant to be spoken by mortals, so one has to possess innate talent in order to master even the easiest of them. My talent is not too good. Sunny looked at her intently and asked, "Is it very important for the catch to have a true name of its own?" The old woman nodded with a smile. Of course, without a true name, a thing does not have pull. It is tenuous and slippery, so sorcery can't stick to it that well. Oh, at least that was how it was explained to me when I was a child. A nameless thing won't be influenced as much, but it will also be unable to exert much influence in turn. That is a rule that goes beyond sorcery as well. Sunny grew silent, contemplating her words. Ananke, meanwhile, looked at them with a strangely wistful emotion in her cloudy eyes. "Actually, I was going to teach you how to control the catch, my lord and lady. If you are willing, of course, since even I was able to master these few names, at least one of you will surely succeed." Sunny and Nephis glanced at each other. Her expression was thoughtful, while his was full of greed. Ah, damn it. He was burning with curiosity and insatiable avarice. Learn a few sorcerous words? Of course, he was willing. However, Sunny had to reluctantly pull himself back. He would indeed love to learn a tiny bit of the word sorcery, but his resources were already spread thin. Apart from shadow dance, he also had to study weaving. His combat skills and aspect powers all required attention too. Becoming distracted by a shiny new toy was only going to slow down his progress. Plus, if Nephis learned these names from Ananke, he could always ask her to teach him in the future. Sunny sighed, then forced himself to say, "I'll decline, for now." His heart was in pain. Nephis looked at him silently, then turned to Ananke and bowed slightly. "Please teach me, grandmother." The old woman nodded with satisfaction. "It will be an honor, my lady." And that was how the first strange thing they noticed was resolved. The second had to do with Ananke herself. It seemed that the further downstream they traveled, the more the old woman changed. Chapter 1300 Riverborn. When Sunny and Nephis first met Ananke, both were concerned about the frail old woman. She just looked too ancient and weak, ready to snap like a twig. Her tan skin was thin and transparent like oil paper, her cloudy eyes teary and dull, her gaunt figure so small that it seemed to be drowning in the black folds of her dark mantle. They were not sure that the old woman could survive another peaceful day, let alone a long and perilous journey across the great river. However, as the days went by, their worries were proven wrong. Old Ananke continued to cling to life. In fact, her condition seemed to be improving little by little. She had more energy now, could remain fully lucid for longer periods of time, and even regain some of her appetite. At first, Sunny thought that it was simply the result of finally having hope again after waiting for the two of them for gods knew how long, as well as eating better. But as more time passed, the difference became too obvious to be explained by mere inspiration. Ananke was definitely changing. Her hands gradually stopped shaking, and her grip on the steering oar became firmer. Her cloudy eyes regained some of their former sharpness. She wasn't hunching as much anymore, and her voice was not as weak and creaky as before. She did not grow tired as quickly as she had at the start, and the long periods of silence where she seemed to doze off with her eyes open happened less and less frequently, until ceasing altogether. It was as though Ananke was slowly growing younger. Sunny had to admit that he was not just imagining things when he opened his eyes one day to notice that there were suddenly a few black strands in her long, snow-white hair. "What is going on?" He looked at Ananke for a few moments, then lowered his gaze to the powerful current of the great river, which flowed into the past. Nephis, who had been practicing the names the old woman taught her, to no result for now, noticed that he was awake and carefully pulled on the sleeve of his tunic. Then, she silently glanced at Ananke and back. Sunny hesitated for a moment. "Me? Why do I have to ask? Asking a woman about her age, does she think I like courting death?" Well, to be honest, His track record indeed suggested that he did. He sighed, threw an indignant glance at Nephis, and approached the old woman while secretly studying her face and thin frame. There was no denying it, Ananke looked much more hale than she had before. She could not be called young by any means, still, but neither could she be called decrepit or ancient. Sunny lingered for a second or two, then asked politely, "Grandmother, can I ask you something?" The old woman smiled at him kindly. "Of course, my lord. Now what am I supposed to say?" Sunny took a deep breath, then just came clean with it. "It might sound weird, but are you, by any chance, getting younger?" Ananke looked at him with a startled expression. Sunny coughed in embarrassment. "I'm sorry, it's just that I noticed that you look better. I don't mean that you didn't look well before." The old woman suddenly chuckled. No, it is me who needs to apologize, my lord. I just have never met someone entirely from outside the tomb of Ariel before. That is why it is not easy for me to account for the fact that you might not know some things that are common sense here." She shook her head and then said gently, "Yes, this body of mine is indeed getting younger. It is because we are moving downstream." Sunny and Nephis looked at each other, perplexed. After a few moments of silence, he furtively studied her slender figure, while she openly studied his. Eventually, Nephis said, "But it doesn't seem like Sunny and I changed. Wouldn't they have become toddlers by now?" Ananke nodded, her expression slightly sad. "Of course not. It is because you are outsiders, while I am riverborn. The outsiders are not beholden to the flow of the great river, since they have come from outside it. They are free to roam it as they wish, traveling any distance. That is why they are also called pilgrims." She smiled. "But we, Riverborn, are different. Since we were born inside the tomb of Ariel, we are beholden to the flow of time within it. We can only travel as far as our lifespans allow, and even then the only direction that is allowed to us is upstream. We are chained to the stretch of the great river where we come from." Sunny looked at her in bewilderment, struggling to imagine what such a life would look like. Wait, how does it even work?" At the same time, Nephis asked, "So, you grow older when you move upstream, and grow younger when you move downstream? That is, in relation to the place where you were born?" Ananke looked between the two of them helplessly, then finally decided to answer Neff's question first and nodded. "Indeed." Sunny blinked a couple of times, then suddenly opened his eyes wide. "Wait, does that mean that as long as you stay in place, you are immortal?" Ananke sighed softly. "Our bodies will not age, my lord. That is not the same as being immortal." She looked at the sparkling expanse of the great river wistfully. "Actually, we Riverborn don't usually live that long, at least not in Weave. Life here is full of hardship and the waters are dangerous. Since we live close to the desolate future, there are many corrupted coming from upstream, all of them immune to the flow of time. Things were fine when we had many outsiders among us, our elders, but as their number dwindled, it grew harder and harder to provide for ourselves and defend the city." The old woman's face grew dark. "After all, it is not easy to fight an enemy that can attack and retreat freely while you lack the ability to pursue it. Still, we managed. Life in Weave might not have been easy or opulent, but it was blissful. At least mine was." Ananke fell silent, a faint smile on her lips. "Now wait a minute." Sunny tilted his head and, unable to control himself, blurted out, "Then, grandmother, no, Ananke, how old are you, really?" What am I doing?" The old woman looked at him and chuckled. "Me? Actually, among the river people, I am considered to be quite a young woman." He froze. Nephis froze too. "Why, young?" Ananke nodded earnestly. "Of course, I am barely 200 years old.